We in it shall be remembered. We few. We happy few. We band of sisters. I spotted him loitering in the shadows of the convent across Governor Forbes Street. The boy was perhaps 12 and as clever and streetwise as every Filipino urchin. He had a burro with him. It was a small animal, perhaps 4 feet at the shoulders. He called it ranunculo, which translates to buttercup in English. That must have been the kid's idea of a joke because the creature looked as just larcenous as its owner. He dawdled in the shadows as we Anglos gathered at the wrought iron fence. I gave him a slight nod, and he strolled over to join the gaggle of Filipinos on the other side. The Japs had hung up bamboo mats to prevent interaction between our 2 groups. That worked for maybe a day. Then convenient holes began to appear, and the heat was getting oppressive, meaning it was a typical June day in Manila. The humidity hovered around 100% and my ratty shirt was soaked. A little time passed. Then the kid turned to me and said calmly, "Señor?" The coast was clear. I looked around. Nobody on my side of the fence was watching. So, I poked a genuine American dollar through a hole. It was wrapped around a rolled-up piece of paper. I said, "Make sure this gets to Mr. Adivoso personally." He gave me a slight nod, which was far too adult, and strolled back to where Buttercup was grazing on grass growing between the cracks in the pavement. The boy mounted the little beast bareback, legs dangling, and clip-clopped off down the street toward the Pasig Bridge. I was sure that my message would get to Adivoso. The Japanese occupiers might be vigilant, but the Filipino resistance was everywhere. My only worry was that someday the Japs would figure out who'd been writing those notes. Grandpa arrived in the Philippines as a private with the 1st Nebraska Infantry. That was in 1898. He served under Otis and then MacArthur Sr., while we persuaded the Spanish to vacate the premises and the native Tagalogs to let us stay. I had Tagalog friends who saw that as more of a conquest. Gramps decided he preferred Manila's heat and humidity to Ogalala's blizzards. So when he mustered out, he used his army connections to set up an import-export business. The business grew as the Philippines became the linchpin of America's Far East strategy. By the time my dad took over in 1929, Grayson & Son was the leading importer of materials for the US military. I got an MD from the University of the Philippines in 1938. Hence, I was technically a medical doctor, but I never intended to practice medicine. What did I care? My family was filthy rich. The only reason I'd spent all those years in school was to keep my dad off my back. He'd wanted me to join the firm right out of prepping at the Colegio de San Juan de Letran school. But if I had, I would have had to show up at work every day, and that would have gotten in the way of my fun. So instead, I dedicated myself to becoming a professional student. Yes, I'll admit it. I might have been smart, but I was shallow. On the other hand, the rest of my peers were just as bad. Fact is, we were universally useless, an over-entitled, spoiled, rotten bunch of rich kids with more money than brains or morals. Still, we were having one hell of a fun time. They called Manila the Pearl of the Orient. It had been Spanish for over 350 years, so it was more like Havana than the other Western-owned places in Asia like Hong Kong, Singapore, or Shanghai. The young crowd lived for its Western-style social events at the exclusive clubs, or betting on the Jai Lai and the big bashes they held at the Manila Hotel. The Santa Ana Cabaret was where everybody went on a hot Manila night. It was divided in half by a picket fence that stretched the width of its cavernous interior. You could get a decent supper on one side, served on white linen tablecloths by elegantly dressed Filipino waiters. The other side was reserved for dancing. The music from the 20-piece orchestra filled both sides with the latest songs. I was sitting on the dancing side when a couple sat at a table on the other side. I'd seen the guy around the Army and Navy Club. His name was Giles something. Like me, he was a legacy from one of the soldiers who'd put down the insurrection 2 generations earlier, not an actual veteran. He didn't have my kind of money, but he was a legendary swordsman with the ladies. I could see where he got his reputation. He was a handsome fellow. But the woman he was with was out of this world. Back then, there was still pure Spanish aristocracia living off the plunder from almost 400 years of occupation. They mainly resided in the plantations outside of town. The woman was clearly one of those. She had long black hair and deep, mysterious dark eyes that radiated roiling sensuality. Her face was a perfect oval with high cheekbones and a tiny, pointed chin beneath a wide, sensual mouth. Her nose was as thin and straight as a conquistador's nasal helmet guard. But her most stunning feature was her hard little body with a fabulous pair of legs. The red cocktail dress emphasized her dark eyes and embraced her incredible curves like it was painted on. The round boobies in her scooped cleavage were like a couple of ripe mangoes. They were so full and luscious that you were tempted to take a bite. I was sitting with Vincente and Skipper at our usual table near the outskirts of the dance crowd, eyeing our prospects for the night. I looked over to see who was sitting down next to us. She and I locked eyes, and something inexpressible passed between us. I was lost. She looked equally upset. But just then, Giles said something to her, and she turned her attention back to enchanting him. I could tell that Giles was just as mesmerized as I was. I had to meet this woman. But I didn't know her name. They had a policy about cigars inside the cabaret, and Giles had one sticking out of the front pocket of his blazer, just above the Army and Navy Club patch. So, I waited until they finished dinner, knowing he would go out onto the patio to have a smoke while his date lingered over her creme de menthe. Right on schedule, Giles arose and said something to her. She gave him a dismissive wave, and he sauntered out the tall French doors and into the warm night air. Manila gets an average of 80 inches of rain a year. That's almost 7 feet for the mathematically challenged. Of course, all that rain's a pain in the arse during the monsoon season, but it also produces some of the lushest and most exotic vegetation on the planet. The terrace the French doors opened onto had broad flagstones and thick stone balustrades, ideal for somebody who wanted to enjoy an excellent hand-rolled Cuban. Giles was puffing away when I joined him with my own expensive stick. We nodded because we'd seen each other around, and I took a perch near him, leaning on the balustrade. We smoked in silence for a while. Then I casually said, "I say, old boy, that's a smashing lady you're with tonight." I knew he would need to brag. Guys like him always need to boast about their conquests. He gave me a smug chuckle and said, "You have no idea. She's the hottest woman I've ever had the pleasure of fucking, and I've been with them all." Now that was a chivalrous way to describe your date, I said, continuing to sound disinterested. "Look Spanish. They're all hot-blooded." He laughed aloud and said, "Hot-blooded doesn't begin to describe Margarita Santos Marquez. She's legendary. I'd almost give up philandering if she would agree to make it permanent, but she says I'm not right for her." I thought, and she's also a good judge of character. So my mystery woman was from that family. Naturally, we all knew each other. The Santos Marquezes were almost as wealthy as mine, and they lived in Makati too. How convenient. I said, "Well, good luck, old chap." He said condescendingly, "Luck doesn't have anything to do with it. We're headed for the Manila Hotel after dinner. That woman can't get enough of me." I thought, tres gallant. But I just nodded and walked away. I now had all the information I needed. Margarita was leaving with Gilles when I went back into the cabaret. Did she glance in my direction? I plopped down next to Skipper. Rumour had it that he occasionally batted from the left-hand side of the wicket, but that was no business of mine. He was fat and jolly and knew all the gossip. I said, "What can you tell me about Margarita Santos Marquez?" He laughed and said, "Ah, the legendary Margarita. So you've fallen under her spell too." I said, irritated, "What are you talking about? Who is she?" Skipper said, "Margarita's beauty has been legendary among the Spanish planter set since her quinceanera, but you know how closely the Spanish plantadors protect the virtue of their marriageable girls. So she was locked away at St. Scholastica's until her 18th birthday." Skipper chuckled lecherously and added, "Now that she's past 18 and out of the clutches of the nuns, She's been cutting quite a swath among the eligible plantador elite. She was with Giles Pemberton tonight, so I see she's branched out to Anglos too. He'd be the obvious first choice. I said, "Do you know where she lives? Where she likes to spend her time?" Both Skipper and Vincente laughed and said sing-song, "He's got it bad!" I ran into Margarita and Giles several times in the succeeding weeks. He looked enthralled. She looked bored. Margarita gave me a longing look whenever we saw each other. It was like she was wondering when I would make my move. I was planning to. But I'd decided to take a different tack from the rest of the slavering dog pack. Margarita's father was Don Carlos Santos Marquez, whose ancestors had ensured that the family would never be poor by appropriating a few hundred square miles of fertile land around Mount Natib, above Balanga on the Bataan Peninsula. Don Carlos was the patriarch. That didn't mean the family lived there. On the contrary, Bataan was too rustic for any civilized person's taste. That was why the family home was not far from us in Makati. I called on Don Carlos at his company's office in Rizal. He took the meeting because he knew my family name. But he didn't know who I was. Don Carlos was a courtly 51-year-old Spaniard with perfect Latin features and impeccable grooming. It's what you get with 10 generations of superior breeding. All in all, an intimidating fellow. He gestured to a chair and said, "How may I help you, senor?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I met your daughter a couple of weeks ago, and she enchanted me. But I know that I need your permission to court her. Hence, I am calling on you today to ask you for it." That was pure, unadulterated bull feathers. The Don's daughter was probably fucking Giles Pemberton's eyeballs out as we spoke. But he didn't know that, and being an old-fashioned plantador, he believed the man must always ask the father's permission before wooing the daughter. My approach had impressed him. He gave me a gracious smile and said, "I appreciate any young person who follows the rules. There are so few of them in your generation. I know that you come from a good family. So you have my permission. When would you care to visit?" The first date was always a family affair. It usually involved dinner so the parents could confirm that you were a gentleman. I said, "At your convenience, Don Santos Marquez." He said, "You may call tonight if that fits your schedule." I said, "Perfect." And he nodded in genteel acknowledgement. So naturally, I wasn't planning to simply show up with a smile on my face and a bottle of wine under my arm. I wore the appropriate dining costume, white linen planter suit with a white silk shirt and club tie. There was a formal introduction to the parents at the entrance. Then I was led in by the butler to take my seat at the family table. That's how things were done back then. Margarita was sitting with her 2 younger sisters, carefully sequestered at the far end of the table. That was to ensure against any hanky-panky between the woman and her suitor. I know that sounds ridiculous, given Margarita's real-life adventures, but conventions had to be obeyed, and the parents never really knew. Margarita looked startled when I walked in. She knew a gentleman caller was coming, but she didn't know who. Then her expression changed to one of cunning respect. She knew exactly what I was up to, and she played along like the blushing virgin that she wasn't. Formal introductions were made. I handed Margarita my card, gloved hand of course, and gave her sisters a dashing smile as I said, "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, girls." They all tittered shyly, while their older sister gave me a surreptitious look that almost made my socks burst into flame. The dining was delightful, as it always was in the better families in Manila. That evening's main course was a pancit guisado that perfectly blended Spanish and Filipino cultures, reminiscent of paella and Tagalog sisig. We ate and drank wine and chatted about the trivialities that ruled life amongst the uber-wealthy. Then Margarita and I were allowed to get to know each other. It isn't what you're thinking. A duenna was sitting with us, of course, but she was Margarita's old nurse, and fabulously hard of hearing. Thus we could talk in whispers and still obey all the conventions. "So," I said earnestly, "I saw you at the Santa Ana, and I had to meet you. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever laid eyes on." She gave me a secret smile and said, "I was hoping you would ask me out. But this is the cleverest ploy ever. My parents and sisters are infatuated with you." I said, "So Giles didn't ask your father's permission?" She said dismissively, "Giles is a blockhead, but he has his uses. I have a tough time getting nice guys to approach me, so I have to settle for those who are too self-centered to know better." I said confidently, "Can we meet again?" She said, "It's what I was hoping. I'll see you tomorrow at the Santa Ana." She stood, extended her hand, and said loudly enough for the nurse to hear, "Thank you for visiting me. You may call on me again next week." Then she gave me a lascivious wink and swept back into the house, with the nurse trailing in her wake. I was standing beneath the portico of the cabaret when Margarita's taxi pulled up. She was in another one of her red dresses with plenty of succulent cleavage and gorgeous legs on display. She glided up to me, put her hand on the side of my cheek and said in her husky, seductive voice, "I hope you haven't been waiting long." And I would have stood there for as long as necessary to have a moment in time like this, but I had to be a wise ass or lose my cred. So, I said with implication in my voice, "I can be patient." What I meant by that remark was clear to both of us. Margarita tapped me lightly on the cheek and said, "It won't be long." Her dark eyes pulled me down a long, slippery slope to a valley of endless carnal delight. She seized my arm possessively, and we strolled into the club. As we were seated, I glanced over to the other side of the house just to see if Skipper and Vicente were there. But, instead, I locked eyes with a thoroughly pissed-off Giles Pemberton. He rose from his seat, walked around to the dining side of the room, said something to the maître d', and chuffed up to our table, snorting fire. My standing to meet him would give his indignation more status than it deserved, so I decided to play it cool. I looked at him with bored contempt and said, "Yes?" He was standing over me threateningly as he said, "I say, old chap, that's bad form trying to steal my girl." I glanced casually at Margarita and said, "What about it, Margarita? Am I stealing his girl?" But of course I knew what her answer would be. She was nobody's girl. Pemberton had pissed her off. She slowly turned her head and looked at him as if trying to decide. Pemberton did everything but spread his tail feathers like a peacock. Then she said in a bored voice, "Go away, Giles. I'm with Eric tonight. Get in my date book if you want to go out with me." I couldn't resist a smirk. I knew I'd made an enemy for life, but what did I care? I was rich. I was with the hottest woman in Manila, and I was going to get my brains fucked out tonight. There's so much late-night traffic in the lobby of the Manila hotel that they have extra desk clerks just to check in the people who've suddenly developed the urge to experience the finest living in Asia. I'd gotten my room key before going over to the Santa Ana, so I handed my supercharged Mercedes SSK 710 Roadster off to the valet and breezed across the lobby to the lift. Our passing turned heads. I was an object of envy for every straight male and a few of the more questionable females. Men are sighthounds by nature, and Margarita is not a woman we can ignore. You stare at that fabulous heart-shaped arse and those perfect tits, and you get that little twinge. It's no doubt genetic, tied to our survival as a species. And yes, I agree. No woman would mate with us if they knew what was happening in our primitive little brains. Our room was expensive, even by Manila hotel standards. Bayside view with tall French doors leading to a substantial balcony and a massive bed. I'd played my hand masterfully to this point, and I wasn't going to blow it at this stage by grabbing her and ripping off her expensive evening gown. These things take patience and class. So I smiled and said, "I have some bubbly chilling on the veranda, darling. Shall we take a glass?" She acknowledged the gambit with a sultry secret smile that told me, "Well played." Manila Bay was as romantic as ever, dotted with ships and with a silvery moon cutting across it. I could see the lights on the far-off Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor at the mouth of the bay. I popped, poured, and handed her a flute. She was looking at me with her mystical dark eyes shining. The breeze was fragrant with hibiscus as the gentle onshore breeze ruffled the lace curtains. The humidity was down, and the night was warm and embracing. Naturally, there were ship noises immediately in front of us, and the sound of traffic on Dewey Boulevard behind us. But it was calm and peaceful up there on our balcony. Margarita's stunning beauty begins with her perfectly proportioned oval face, but the depth of her huge dark eyes promotes her attractiveness from something merely special to extraordinary. Those eyes were looking at me with an equal measure of appraisal and desire. It was like she'd made a preliminary decision, but there was something she needed to find out before she made it permanent. We were standing side by side, leaning on the railing sipping our drink, when she took my flute and set it next to hers. Then she put her hands on my arms and turned me fully toward her. She was ready. The waiting game had paid off.
Ben!
She grabbed the back of my head and pulled me down for a scorching kiss. She moaned, her mouth opened like a flower, and we exchanged probing tongues. That should have been the point where I grabbed her by one butt cheek and a tantalizing melon and carried her off to bed. But then again, that was what she expected. So, I put my arms around her and gently pulled her to me. My left hand was decorously at her waist, and my right hand was on the skin of her bare back. Then I bent her over in a kiss like something out of a romantic storybook. She hesitated, confused for a second. Then she made a slight noise and began to kiss back enthusiastically. It was finally time for the endgame. I took Margarita's hand and led her gently toward the bed. She looked a little dazed. Good. I stopped beside the bed and stared directly into her deep dark eyes. She was looking back as I gently unzipped her gown. It was like gazing into the eyes of a hungry tiger. Unspeakable forces were about to be unleashed. I already knew that Margarita was wearing nothing but a thin pair of panties and a garter belt. Very little material was in the front of her dress, and the entire back was missing. But the sight that was revealed as her dress fell to the floor was something I'll never forget. Margarita Santos Marquez had an amazing body. All the proportions were perfect, not too much, not too little, just right. She had every one of the female contrasts, hard and soft, broad and narrow, tiny and large, smooth and slightly hairy. At that moment, the tips of her beautiful breasts rose and fell like the Pacific in a typhoon, and she was clearly experiencing a transcendingly lustful moment. I was shucking my clothing as she gracefully assumed the classic prone position, hips thrust forward and open, shoulders and palms lying flat on the bed, her nearest leg stretched out flat, toes pointed, the other bent in anticipation. Now she was gasping like it was a matter of life and death. I climbed between her invitingly spread legs and paused. The aim was to make her need it and want it. She made an impatient sound as she grabbed and inserted me. The trip up her fiery passage triggered a loud groan of satisfaction. She had a hard body except those two exquisite little melons squished against my chest, and she was hot. It might have been a matter of just a couple of degrees, but her mouth and other orifice were blazing. When I hit bottom, her eyes opened so wide that I could see the whites around them, and she shrieked. This woman definitely felt it. This was going to be a wild ride. She grabbed the back of my head and dragged me down for another blistering, open-mouthed kiss. Her incoherent noises as our tongues duelled were an auditory gauge of her arousal. Then she wailed, slammed her arms and legs around me, and began to buck furiously while muttering in Spanish. Like most Anglos, I didn't have the Spanish tongue, but I could tell what she was saying by the emphasis on the words. The Spanish term I knew was folar, which means fuck. That was every third word. I was on top of her, but I had no sense that she was helpless underneath me. I had to use all of my strength just to corral her, because she was throwing me around, writhing and bucking with frantic urgency. My beautiful partner was lost in the act. We were both sweating from exertion on that hot night, and her natural lubrication was so copious that I slid all over the place, trying to stay in her. She wasn't helping by her agitated movements. In fact, if you'll pardon the inappropriate analogy, it was like wrestling a greased pig. Then she added one more novel sensation. She began to growl. It wasn't a grunt or a moan. Instead, it was a full-throated sound that would have been suitable coming from a timber wolf. That primitive noise raised some atavistic instinct, and I lost it. I put my arms behind her knees and spread her wide. She growled deeper. I pounded on her so hard that sailors on the ships in the harbour must have heard the wet slapping. Finally, she let out an almost hypersonic shriek, and her hard body jackknifed beneath me. Her eyes were wide open, almost frightened. Her mouth formed the most expansive "oh," and her passage went nuts. She put her hands against my shoulders and shoved me off with uncanny strength. Then she flopped around on the bed like a recently boated sailfish. Her face registered the distress you would see on a person experiencing excruciating pain, or pleasure. I hadn't gotten my cookies yet, so as soon as she stopped flopping, I opened her back up and entered her again. She lay there panting and exhibiting all the symptoms of a person in shock. As I slid back into her, her hips made a furious up and down motion. She hyperventilated loudly and reflexively came again. I began violently pounding down the home stretch, and she started crying. It wasn't sadness, it was like she was blowing off emotional steam. I finally crossed the finish line, and there were a couple of moments that I will never be able to recall. Margarita was making odd gurgling noises of satisfaction right next to my ear. At the same time, I was engaged in what felt like a series of life-threatening spasms. I finally rolled off and lay next to her, arm on my forehead, trying to get my breathing back to normal. She looked like she had passed out, or she was maybe deep within herself, experiencing the same sense of unreality. What was that? Calling it sex wasn't close to correct. It was more like the first human mating, intensely primordial and feral. I looked at her, puzzled. She was just as confused. Finally, I said, sincerely and honestly, "I have never done anything like that in my life, have you?" I know that was an ungentlemanly question, and I would not like the answer if she'd said, "Yes, daily." But I just had to find out. She said wonderingly, "I don't know what came over me. I know what an orgasm feels like. But this was something different. It was like I had lost control of my soul. For a moment, I wasn't sure I would survive it. It absorbed my whole consciousness." And that was how Margarita Santos Marquez and Eric Grayson became an item around town. I'm not sure you would call it love. It was more like we shared the same superficial values and qualities. We were beautiful people who were wealthy, over-entitled, and wholly self-absorbed. Our duty was to show the less remarkable members of the species what social and cultural superiority looked like. We went to all the best parties and did all the expected things. Margarita's stunning beauty was as much an accessory as my expensive clothing and hot sports car. It was proof that I was the top dog. I did the same thing for her. Having a rich and handsome lover with an impeccable family pedigree and a resultant sense of upper-class style made her the woman that every other woman wanted to be. Better yet, we had elevated sex to an art form. Margarita was gorgeous and sensual, of course, but there were women in Manila who were close to her level of attractiveness. Nevertheless, Margarita had something that separated her from conventional beauties in the same way that famous movie stars elevate themselves above merely attractive women. She could give an erection to a stone idol. The thing of it is, Margarita really felt it, right down to the tips of her bright red painted toenails. So, she could surrender herself in a way that made a guy feel like he was the most powerful man in the universe. It gave her an innate eroticism that screamed woman. Of course, in those ridiculously egotistical days, my pride was justification alone for spending all my time and money entertaining her. I was the envy of my peers, but something else was also beginning to happen. I was getting to know Margarita, and I liked her. She had a role to play as a society femme fatale and played it well. But there was an elemental freshness about her, a sense of humour and joie de vivre that made her a great companion for day drives out to Nagsasa Cove and Malabrigo Point, or just sitting and talking on a hot Manila night on the porch of the mansion. I wouldn't call it love. That's because I only had room in my heart for one person, myself. And I know that was also the case with Margarita. In effect, it was more like two selfish people who enjoyed spending time with each other. But we were constantly together, and that familiarity brought us closer in ways neither of us had experienced before. We might have eventually married and lived the moneyed life of our parents and ancestors, social climbing, discreet affairs, and all. But then the Japanese arrived and changed that. Not that we'd have ever noticed it, but the world around us was evolving in meaningful ways. There was a war in Europe, and Japan was having its way with the Chinese. The United States were still sitting on the sidelines, but the question was, when would we be dealt into the game? The papers said not to worry. Japan would never attack the Philippines because Manila Bay was the home of the mighty US Asiatic Fleet, a line of defense that our enemies could never cross. The problem was that Isoroku Yamamoto was a daring poker player, as he'd proven during his student days at Harvard, and he was about to deal us into the game. It was another hot and humid night in early December. Margarita and I were attending a crazy wild party at the Manila Hotel's Fiesta Pavilion. The 27th bomb group threw it. They had recently arrived from the US. It was typical for the era, marked by raucous laughter, off-key singing, the tinkling of glasses, and squealing girls. Margarita and I were sitting under a cascade of scarlet bougainvillea in the hotel's bamboo bar, when I wittily remarked, "I hope they can fly better than they can sing." I'm such a comedian, I just kill myself. One of the women sitting with the aforementioned flyers sniffed and gave me a disdainful look. I said under my breath, "Stuck up, bitch." Margarita dissolved in laughter. The party went on into the wee hours of the morning. I remember it well because it marked the last fragile moments of my happiness. The war began promptly at 03 on December 8th. Since Manila was on the other side of the international date line, it was 08 and Sunday, December 7th at Pearl Harbor. But of course we didn't know anything had happened because Margarita and I were fucking the night away. The following day we were sipping coffee on the balcony, both terminally hungover, when waves of planes swept low over Dewey Boulevard. They were beautiful and silver in the bright sunlight. We both thought they were American. Then we heard the anti-aircraft fire and the loud crunch of bombs coming from the direction of Clark Field. I rushed to turn on our little Bakelite Crosley, only to find out that the US was in a state of war with the Empire of Japan. That put a distinct damper on Monday morning's fun. I did do one smart thing, though. I hustled down to the Bank of the Philippines in Intramuros and withdrew a sizable chunk of cash in gold double eagles and bills. It was pure instinct. But I figured the bank would run out of money if the Japanese invaded, and I wanted all the liquidity I could get. As conditions evolved, it was the best thing I could have ever done. I stashed the money at the bottom of a fine leather Gladstone bag that I'd pretended to carry in my capacity as a not-quite doctor. The few actual instruments, wrappings and medicines covered the fortune stuffed in the bottom. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Air raid sirens constantly sounded throughout the day, and anxious guards shot at any light source all night. The sound of one nervous volley would set off a spatter of firing all over the city. Margarita was in a different situation than I was. She was a Filipino, not an American. Hence, she wasn't a prospective prisoner of war. Me? I was facing uncertainty as an enemy civilian. Internment, or even worse. The city of Manila was declared open the day after Christmas. The bombing stopped, and the transport system went back to running. I was on the balcony watching the smoke rise over the Bataan Peninsula. You could hear the constant roar of a battle across Manila Bay. I was wondering uneasily what would happen next. Margarita had been away for a couple of weeks up in Makati, visiting her folks. She looked determined when she got back. I grabbed her and tried to kiss her, but she turned her head. That was a new element. I said, puzzled, "What's the matter with you?" She looked at me sympathetically and uttered those 4 fatal words. "We need to talk." That didn't sound promising. Margarita adopted the tone you would use to explain something to a child as she said, "It's been fun, Eric, but the Japanese are in charge now, and Papa told me they're planning to lock all you Anglos up for the duration. It isn't going to be pleasant whatever they choose to do. So I'm leaving." Seriously? The little bitch was abandoning me. I suppose it shouldn't have been surprised, since that's what I would have done to her if the shoe were on the other foot. But wait. There's more. She took a deep breath and added, "I can stay here and take my chances with the Japanese, or I can leave for America today with Giles Pemberton." I said, outraged, "Pemberton?" She said, "Yes, him. He has a ticket on the last Pan Am clipper out of the Philippines. It's taking off tonight from down in Santa Cruz, and I plan to be on it with him." I was genuinely shocked. I thought that I was the centre of Margarita's universe. I snarled, "Why, you little slut? Have you been fucking him?" She looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "Not yet, darling. When would I have had the time? But you aren't so utterly naive that you'd think I wouldn't have to give him some kind of reward for getting me out of this hopeless situation." I had no response. Naturally, I hated losing access to Margarita's beautiful body and, more importantly, losing out to Pemberton. But Miles could provide a way out of the current circumstance, and I couldn't. That realization crushed me, but it was also my first step toward a tiny bit of self-awareness. I was finally getting the hint that the world didn't revolve around me, as counterintuitive as that might have seemed at the time. Margarita added lightly, "We had fun, my dear, but you have nothing to offer me now, so you simply must accept that." I continued to stand there in utter shock. How could I be so stupid? She added blithely, "I won't bother to kiss goodbye. I'll just say buena suerte." And she turned and swept out of the room, looking exactly like a woman with a plane to catch. Even though it was a profound blow to my self-esteem, Margarita's selling herself for a ticket on the Philippine Clipper never disillusioned me in the way you might expect. Naturally, the little whore would throw in her lot with whoever was more beneficial to her. I knew that from the beginning. Still, it was gratifying to think that Miles would eventually suffer the same fate, because a snake is always a snake. I'm ashamed to admit that I took Margarita's abandoning me rather hard. It might have been because I missed the scintillating sex. Maybe it was because she'd beaten me at my own game. Anyhow, I spent the next 2 days in an intoxicated haze, throwing recently emptied liquor bottles at the framed picture of the two of us at Tagaytay. The frustrating part was that I was too drunk to hit the picture. I thought that that was the lowest point in my life, but of course that just shows you how silly and naive I was back then. The Japanese entered Manila early the following day, Friday, January 2nd, 1942, less than 1 month after their sneak attack on Pearl Harbor ended any chance of the US reinforcing us. I was sitting upstairs in the Manila hotel, playing cards with Skipper and a few of our other American friends. We'd been going at it all night when somebody poked their head in and shouted, "They're here!" We all rushed out to the street to view our conquerors. The Japs came up the boulevard in the pre-dawn glow, riding on bicycles and tiny motorcycles. Their little flags with the one red ball looked like children's pennants. They came without conversation, and in tight order. The ridiculous pop-popping of their one-cylinder engines rang loud in the silent city. They were short and stocky, strutting along with closed, cruel looks. As an Anglo, I had never really paid attention to the Asians around me. The sight of the endless waves of alien faces, people who were not like me, was chilling. A Japanese officer detached himself from the marching horde and approached those of us gathered in front of the hotel. He was a little banty rooster wearing a long sword that looked like it was always in peril of tripping him. He stopped, surveyed us with contempt, and announced in perfect English, "All American, British and Dutch citizens will remain in this place until they are registered." He gestured, and 4 nondescript little fellows with bayonet-tipped rifles detached themselves from the marching waves and began to poke at us to drive us indoors. Skipper, who was always one of the more entitled of our elite set, objected strenuously. "I say, old man, you can't do this to us. We're American citizens. The officer growled something in Japanese, and one of the soldiers drove his bayonet into Skipper's midsection. Skipper got an astonished look on his fat face, gurgled something, and blood erupted from his mouth. Then my witty and decadent friend just crumpled and lay there, jolly and full of life one minute, dead meat the next. It was my introduction to the horrors of war. I was shocked. That could easily have been me. The officer nudged Skipper's body with his toe and said, "Dispose of this." The fact that he said it in English hammered the point home. This was an alarming new reality. We weren't considered prisoners of war, like the poor souls who marched 70 miles from their surrender on Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. But we were citizens of the countries that the Japanese were at war with. Thus, we were potential security risks. As a result, they wanted to put us in one place to keep an eye on us. Japan's easy conquest of Manila had surprised everyone, including the Japs. Now that they were our masters, their immediate problem was where to house us. It had to be a site big enough to hold every American, British, and every other Allied resident of Luzon, which was upwards of 7,000 folks. Over the next several days, the occupying troops worked to collect the people they termed enemy aliens. We were a diverse bunch: business executives, mining engineers, bankers, plantation owners, seamen, waiters, beachcombers, prostitutes, and even old-timers from the Spanish-American War. Once we'd all been catalogued and tagged, they transported us across the Pasig to intern us. The Japanese called the site the Santo Tomas internment camp, also known as the Manila internment camp. It was, in reality, the 60-acre campus of the University of Santo Tomas. That name still evokes nightmares. It was nearly 100 degrees on a sunny day in Manila when my group stumbled through the front gate of the walled compound. This would be our new home for the near future. A surprisingly small number of Japanese guards escorted us. It's hard to be heroic when you're beaten for any indiscretion. Added to the shock of our sudden reversal of fortune, it made us all quite docile. About 4,000 persons would eventually live in Santo Tomas, but the people from the Manila Hotel were among the earliest to arrive. So, the campus was still relatively open and pleasant. But more importantly, I got my pick of living quarters in the university's classroom buildings. I staked out a nice corner spot near a window on the 3rd floor. It gave me a slight breeze. The average space allotted for internees was 20 square feet, but I appropriated closer to 25. I waited until it was pitch black the first night to cut a hidey hole through the plaster behind my things. Then I spent the entire night stashing coins and bills between the walls. You might have wondered about my state of mind. Well, frankly, I was energized. Astonishing, did you say? Remember that we all thought our imprisonment would last a few weeks, so this was something different, a diversion. We were all convinced that the United States would quickly defeat Japan. Once they had, we would be known as the heroes of Santo Tomas. I know, that sounds fabulously naive in hindsight. But you have to understand we lived in a world where Anglo-American domination was unquestioned. The idea that an upstart nation populated by people not remotely like us could prevail over Western European armies was simply unimaginable. Nevertheless, the world had changed. Westerners might have had the advantage of technology and manufacturing throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, but the Japanese were innovative and they had learned. Thus, when the rumour came down in April of '42 that American forces on Bataan had surrendered, we began to think the unthinkable. Then the fall of Corregidor sealed our fate. We realised that we would be stuck in that shithole until death did we part. It was utterly unreal. You kept expecting the ordinary world of comfort and privilege to return, but instead, you found yourself caught in a continuing nightmare of heat, bugs, deprivation, subjugation, and suffering. Epidemics of typhoid fever, caused by abysmal sanitation in the overcrowded camp, were a regular occurrence. Then, there was also a prisoner of war's normal ration of shit, accidents, tropical diseases, and malnutrition. I particularly hated the rats. It wasn't until later that they became a delicacy. The food was unpalatable, and there was never enough of it. We sweated and scratched and lived in filth and stink. But the worst of it was the endless boredom. The natural response was, "Why me?" And I'd been one of the social elites before December 8th. Then a mere 2 months later, I was a faceless prisoner, existing at the whim of an alien and unfathomable people. The culture shock was beyond tolerating. As far as I was concerned, my life was over. I would go to sleep every night praying I wouldn't wake up in the morning. The unfortunate reality of my new circumstance was hard to bear. I suffered from crippling bouts of self-pity and a constant sense of abject loneliness. The thought of Margarita fucking her way across the Pacific with that reptile Giles Pemberton just put the cherry on top of a big pile of steaming, unjustified dung. The Japanese mostly left us to fend for ourselves within the camp's walls. We were irrelevant to their plans, an inconvenient byproduct of their success, to be dealt with strictly by the conventions of war. Their only requirement was that we attend a 7:30 p.m. roll call every night. Otherwise, my life was one day after another of living in hell. It was stiflingly hot and humid, and it rained a lot. 30 people crowded into my classroom. 1,200 men shared 13 toilets and 12 showers. Of course, the place stank to high heaven. Modesty and privacy were laughable concepts. Cleanliness was unthinkable. It wasn't just men either. Upwards of 1,200 women were interned at Santo Tomas. We were segregated by sex, even the married couples, and Japanese guards with bayonets put a damper on any potential hanky-panky during the nights. Yet, in some respects, it began to feel like we were living in a small, overcrowded city. We even had our own government, a governing board of internees, who the Japanese had appointed to care for our healthcare and living needs. Now that was a hopeless task. We were unhealthier and getting hungrier by the day. We were fed communally. We got morning and evening meals at a mess tent. But the Japanese rationed us to 2,000 calories per day. That barely kept the internees from starving to death. All of us experienced weight loss. At first we could buy food at the camp markets, but the price went up as supply shrank, especially on the luxury items like soap, toilet paper, and meat. Then meat disappeared entirely. In return, we ate insects and wild plants. People without the money for food suffered from weakness and edema, and most of them began to develop the symptoms of malnutrition. Yet whatever your status pre-internment, we were all reduced to a state of absolute degradation, filthy, hopeless, and starving. Even so, it was business as usual for the Filipinos on the other side of the fence. They were sympathetic, but not so much so that they were willing to join us in that hellhole of despair. Instead, they went about their daily business as if there weren't hordes of starving Anglos watching them through the wrought iron bars of the fence. They were willing to trade creature comforts for cash. So, internees who had money could buy food. We were also allowed to build bamboo and palm frond huts in the open ground in the quadrangle between buildings. Those gave us privacy and refuge from the heat during the day. It helped alleviate the stress of living in that overcrowded pigsty. We did our best, but the situation was getting desperate. People were dying from the ever-present tropical diseases. First, it was the aged and weak. Then it was everybody. It was terrifying. I was just waiting for my time to come when the camp entrance opened like the pearly gates, and a group of women marched through. They called themselves the Battling Bells. But history had a much more appropriate name for them. These were the legendary Angels of Bataan. The Japanese captured 66 Army and 11 Navy nurses when Corregidor surrendered. Those women should have been evacuated when Dugout Doug scuttled off to Australia, but they'd courageously chosen to stay at their posts in the hell of the Malinta Tunnel, nursing the wounded and dying. They were in their khaki uniforms wearing Red Cross armbands to establish their status as medical personnel. They looked coolly competent, absolutely fearless, and totally in control, even though each had been dragged through a much more profound level of misery than any of us could ever imagine. It was an eye-watering, inspirational sight for all of us. There was a little discussion with Earl Carroll as the group arrived. He was the guy the Japanese had appointed head of our internee board. Then the nurses headed as an organised body toward the Santa Catalina building on the eastern end of the compound. Their leader turned and addressed the internees who'd gathered in the morning's heat to view their arrival. Standing tall and proud, she stood and looked us over, ramrod straight in the withering heat. We must have seemed like a motley crew. Whatever clothing we'd brought with us had deteriorated in the tropical climate to the point where we were like a smelly gang of hobos. We also looked her over. Even though she'd been through the Battle of Bataan and the Siege of Corregidor, Captain Maud Davison was tough and unfazed. She was an older woman, perhaps in her middle 50s. I thought to myself, she has no toleration for bullshit. She said briskly, "We are military nurses. We are here to provide medical care for you, and we will be establishing a facility over there." She pointed toward the Santa Catalina building, "where we will treat anybody who needs our help." We all muttered agreement. Then Maud paused and said, "We can always use a helping hand, so please identify yourself if anybody in this group has medical training, nurses, orderlies, or the like." Our internee group had expanded to perhaps 300 people by that point, but we all stood there like a flock of sheep. Nobody moved. Finally, Maud got a stubborn look and said, "Anybody. Even if you have no medical background, we need people to help maintain the sanitariness of the wards." I knew that Maud and her nurses would do whatever it took, no matter whether anybody helped them. But it was also clear that they were even more exhausted than we were, having been in intense combat since early January. I'd been feeling very sorry for myself over the past 7 months. The only excuse for all my thumb-sucking was that I was overwhelmed by my fall from grace. But the sight of this brave woman standing there in the hot sun stirred something new and strange in me. So, on impulse, I stepped out of the group. The little voice in my head shouted appalled, and not a little bit pissed off, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" I said, "I've had internship training as a general surgeon, but I didn't complete the residency." Relief crossed her face. They needed MDs, even an inexperienced person like me. Then she took a closer look. She said skeptically, "You're a bit old to be in medical school, aren't you, Sonny?" I wasn't going to explain that I hadn't finished, because I was an idle libertine who would rather die than do an honest day's work. That might reflect poorly on me. So instead I pulled a sad face and said, "Circumstances intervened. I didn't want to admit that the MD was an elaborate hoax to stay out of the family business." She said, "Walk with me." So I strolled with her toward her new hospital. My stomach was churning. I knew I was a fraud. I mean, I had absorbed all the necessary knowledge, but I had never done any actual doctoring. Even worse, although I had observed at surgeries, I had never cut anybody but a cadaver. Maud Davison was a canny old bird. The first words out of her mouth were, "Okay, what's going on here, sonny boy? Are you a doctor or aren't you? This is a deadly serious business, and I can't afford to put an imposter in a position where people's lives are at stake." Maud was right. I was no kind of doctor if you meant somebody who could capably diagnose and treat a person with a medical condition. I was bright enough. But I had barely scraped through the academics because my mind was always elsewhere, usually in the gutter. And I'd spent most of the hands-on training daydreaming about what I would do after I got off shift. Maybe it was the lack of human essentials or my utter defeat at the hands of the Japanese. But I had been thinking a lot about my previous life. Growing up, I was proud to admit that I was a taker, not a giver. And as for my ethics, the right thing to do was whatever I benefited from. Hence, my morals were purely transactional. I used people to satisfy my needs and threw them away once they'd served their purpose, merely because I could. My money and social standing insulated me from any consequences, and the idea that other people had feelings was an alien concept. Accordingly, little of what I had seen and learned had sunk in even though I had the training to be a doctor. But of course that was a perfectly appropriate state for me to be in, given that I had been a profligate and dissolute playboy throughout the entire period of my growing up. Mine was a self-satisfying life of women and fun without the slightest point to it, except chasing after the next empty pleasure. I hadn't earned a cent of the money I enthusiastically spent. I wasn't dedicated to anything but enjoying myself, of course, which had created a chasm in my soul. Then the Japanese showed up and ruined the fun. Even worse, they provided some unwilling insight. Maybe the circumstance of being tossed into a cesspool of human suffering had fostered that newfound self-knowledge. But Santo Tomas had stripped the essentials of life down to the mere act of survival, and in the process, it had shown me how useless and irrelevant I was. Now I saw Maud's offer as a chance to atone for a few sins and maybe discover what I had previously missed in my life. So I found myself saying, I won't lie, I was never serious about being a doctor. I graduated from the University of the Philippines and did a standard first-year residency. But I was fabulously wealthy, and I didn't need to practice. I just got the degree as something to pass the time. I couldn't admit how little altruism there was in my life. Maud stopped and looked at me astutely. It was like she had known that all along. She was a different kind of woman. I'd never encountered one like her before. Women like Margarita were nobodies, mere afterthoughts. Margarita would live and die without making the slightest difference in the world and leave heartache in her wake. By contrast, Maud Iverson was important. She was strong. Maud affected lives. Maud made the world better. She was a person of respect. Her angular face reminded me of a fierce bird of prey as she said, "My nurses can prop you up while you get your feet under you, sonny boy. But it's up to you to make yourself into a better man. People will die if you fail us. So I want you to promise that you will do your level best. It's all I can ask from anybody who serves under me." That was a turning point. If I had looked Maud in the eye and said, "I can't promise that, since I honestly didn't know whether I had the guts to face the challenge," I would join Margarita in that doomed group of nameless, beautiful people whose presence on this earth is purely immaterial. But there was something in Maud's selflessness, her savage dedication to helping others, that made me say, "I promise to try my best. I won't let you down." There wasn't exactly a heavenly choir to mark the occasion, but I felt like I was on a different path. It would be a more arduous one, but it was the right one. Maud's women were veteran combat nurses. All of them had gone through the brutal fighting on Bataan, caring for the sick and wounded in outdoor hospitals in all weather conditions. Each of them had endured the nightmare of the Malinta Tunnel. And throughout that time, they'd displayed the bravery, dedication, and esprit de corps that the best military units always exhibit. When we arrived at Santa Catalina, I found the Angels energetically rearranging the building into the wards, labs, and intake facilities needed to provide top-flight medical care. There was little talking as they created order out of chaos. It was inspirational. I got a faint whiff of hope that I might survive. Maud walked me up to the woman overseeing all that activity. This was her second-in-command, Josephine Nesbitt. All the nurses called Maud Miss, whereas Josephine Nesbitt was just Josie, or sometimes Mama Josie. It wasn't from any lack of respect. Josephine Nesbitt was the heart and soul of the Angels. Josie was the woman responsible for motivating the Angels and keeping them disciplined. She wasn't even supposed to be there. When MacArthur had been rescued from Corregidor in early March, Josie had been offered the opportunity to join him in his humiliating bug-out. But she refused to leave her girls. She already had shown a penchant for doing that. Previously, she'd refused to be evacuated to Corregidor after Bataan fell. That is, until the US agreed to take her Filipino nurses along with the rest of the Angels. The Filipinos had suffered alongside their American counterparts, and there was no way Josie would leave them behind. I mean, seriously, in the dictionary under courage and leadership, it says, "See Josephine Nesbitt." Maud was an older woman, tall and lean. Josie was shorter and nondescript, with brown hair. She looked like she had just stepped off a Missouri farm, but the strength of spirit and energy just radiated from her. She was an intimidating person. That was because I knew that she could see right through me. Maud said, "Eric, here is an unlicensed MD." Josie understood exactly what that meant. She said, Did you intern? I said, I did a surgical first year. She said, did you operate? I said, I observed, but I was not allowed to do anything other than close. She gave me a look that told me precisely what she thought of that answer. She said, why didn't you do the rest of the residency? I said, because I wanted to explore other opportunities. I didn't have to tell her that those opportunities mainly consisted of alcohol and women. I could see it in her eyes. Then she said aloud, so you were one of the Army and Navy Club set, right? At least she didn't modify that statement with useless. Josie Nesbitt had clearly spent a lot of time in the Philippines. I nodded my head in mute agreement. We understood each other. She seemed to make up her mind. She yelled across the room, Ronnie, come here a minute, will ya? A woman on the far side of the hall was laying out cots. She nodded, unfolded the one she was holding, placed it carefully, precisely 5 feet from the previous one, and started to walk toward us. Josie said, Ronnie is one of our best nurses and my right-hand girl. She'll help you get your feet under you. The woman approaching us had the same no-nonsense appearance as the rest of the angels, which in and of itself would have been intimidating. However, the factor that made it far worse was that she was simply gorgeous. She was bathed in sweat. Her thick hair was a tangled mess, and there was dirt on her face. But she had huge, wide-set grey eyes that held an intoxicating cocktail of intelligence, grit, and sadness. You could see that this woman had been to hell and back twice. And yet, nothing on God's green earth would stop her from making the trip once again if duty called. Her ash-blonde hair was cut into an easy-to-maintain bob. Her features were perfectly arranged on a heart-shaped face with a long, narrow nose, sculptured cheekbones, and a wide, almost lascivious mouth. Her khaki blouse was threadbare, but it was clean and patched, and what lay beneath looked spectacular. I was trying not to convey what I was thinking, but I failed miserably because the woman gave me a look of utter contempt as she said, "What do you want, Josie?" Josie said, "Eric, here is an MD. He has a degree and did his first-year residency in general surgery, but unfortunately, he didn't go on to complete or get certified." I said defensively, "I only graduated 3 years ago." Ronnie looked at me astutely and said, "Did you have something better to do than practice medicine?" I said, "It's complicated." Josie interrupted, "Eric, I want you to meet Veronica Chase. She was at Sternberg with me, so she knows what life was like in Manila before the Japanese." I said, "Oh." There was a world of conversation left unsaid. Ronnie glanced at me as if I'd crawled from under a rock. She knew the real story. It hurt. Josie told Ronnie, "I'm going to give you a special assignment since I know I can trust you. I want you to stick close to Eric and get him up to speed. He may not know how to be a doctor, but he has the knowledge to practice medicine, and I want you to make him into one." Veronica, or as she was called, Ronnie, looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon as she said, "We're not a teaching hospital, Mama. Don't you think we have enough to do with malaria and dysentery, not to mention the babies we'll have to deliver?" Josie said peremptorily, "We need to utilise the assets we've got. This guy has surgical training. If we get him even halfway capable, he will be a huge asset, which will be your job." I said, sounding a bit hurt, "You two do know that I'm standing right here, don't you?" Ronnie obviously didn't like me. She looked at me with disdain and said, "I've seen you around town, kiddo. I know that you'll never amount to anything. It will be hard enough to keep the people in this camp alive. Turning a spoiled, rotten playboy into a real man wastes my time." I remembered a stunning female on the arm of various American officers at the Santa Ana Club. The exhausted woman in front of me was wearing a war-torn khaki blouse and holding it together by sheer grit. I wondered if she might be the same person. Josie said, appalled, "Ronnie!" It looked like she was about to administer some military discipline for Ronnie being so frank. I blurted, "No, she's right. I was exactly what she said before this all happened. I was self-indulgent and useless. But there's nothing like having it all taken away to open your eyes. So, I'm ready to give it my best shot. I know my stuff. I just don't know how to apply it. That's where I need help. They both reacted like they hadn't expected me to say that. Ronnie looked stunned. It was like I'd stomped all over her dearly held beliefs about guys like me. Josie said cajolingly, "Just take him under your wing for a couple of weeks, Ronnie. Then we'll find somebody else if you don't feel like he's making progress." Ronnie looked at me sullenly. Her beautiful grey eyes were full of anger as she said, "I'll show you the ropes, sport. But that's all, and it will stop the minute you slack or act like a spoiled little brat. I've nursed the real men fighting this war, guys who know what bravery, dedication and suffering are, and you have a long way to go before you're one of them." I thought, so tell me what you really think about me. But it also pissed me off. She'd issued a challenge. I was going to do whatever it took to prove this bitch wrong. I said, "We'll see." Then I added, "I'm here and ready to start. What do I do first?" I expected her to tell me to fetch my medical bag so I could start doctoring. Ronnie looked at me with amusement and said, "See that big pile of cots over there? I want you to help me fill this room with them spaced exactly 5 feet apart with 12 feet between rows." Then she turned to Josie and said, "If I get too far ahead of this clown, the deal is off." That angered me, I said, trying to sound calm. "No problem, sweetie." I walked over to the approximately shoulder-height pile and grabbed the first cot. How in the world do you unfold this infernal thing? I was struggling with the damn cot when Ronnie walked over and took it. She unfolded it and locked it in a few deft moves. Then she handed it to me. Her look of absolute contempt said it all. She said sarcastically, "No problem, sweetie. You'll pick up the knack eventually. I learned that in the middle of a driving rainstorm while my patients were lined up in a muddy trench." That was rock bottom. The old me would have thrown a hissy fit. The man I'd been turned into in this Japanese hellhole would have curled up on the floor and died from sheer despair. But there was something inexplicable going on with this woman. For an unfathomable reason, I wanted to make myself worthy of her respect, which drove me to persevere. I said mildly, "Look, I know you think I'm worthless, and I can't change that. But the world's different now, and I'm trying to adapt as much as possible. I know I've got a long way to go, but I want to contribute as best as I can, and I think I can do it if you'd just give me a break." For a second, her beautiful face dropped its hard-ass attitude. Then she caught herself and said, "Okay, I'll agree to be your mama for a while because we need all the help we can get. Show me what you've got, and if you're even remotely competent, we'll get along fine." We spent the next 5 hours working side by side, unfolding and placing cots in 100-degree heat. I was bathed in sweat, but I had spent the past 7 months taking it easy as a prisoner. Ronnie had just arrived that day from the brutal siege of Corregidor. Still, she never faltered. She needed that ward up fast, and it was clear she would drive herself until the job was done. We eventually stood there looking at a fully functional hospital ward. Both of us were panting and drained from the heat and exertion. Ronnie's hair was soaked like she'd been swimming. Unfortunately, her blouse and skirt were plastered to her magnificent body, and the sight gave me unholy thoughts. For the first time in my life, I suppressed them. Astonishing. I had no desire to disrespect the heart and courage of this magnificent woman by looking at her like a sex object. Our hard day's work together had built a tentative camaraderie, so carnal thinking was out. I said, panting, "Have you eaten?" She shook her head and said, "I haven't had much to eat since they brought us over from Corregidor." I said, "I have some special things that I've been able to buy through the fence if you would fancy a bite." That was a mistake. She drew her weary self to her full 5'4" height and said, outraged, as if I'd utterly disrespected her, "I eat with the other nurses. We share our hardships. You don't know what that's like, do you, Buster? I mean, I got it." She was making it clear that she thought I was a self-centered pig, even if what I'd just asked was motivated by a genuine concern for her well-being. We were a long way from understanding each other. I said defensively, "Look, I was just worried about you. You worked your butt off, and you can't keep going without taking care of yourself. So, eat with the nurses if that's how you do it, but don't get mad at me for being concerned." She gave me an odd look as if I had surprised her and said, "I'm sorry. I just can't get it out of my head that you've changed." She said that as if we'd run into each other in the past. I said, puzzled, "Have we met before?" I could sort of recall a dazzling woman in a shimmery blue evening gown. Where was it? Was it the last party at the Manila Hotel? She was with one of the B-17 pilots. His name was Kelly, if I remember correctly. I wondered what had become of that guy. She said lightly, "We've met, but it's immaterial. This is another world now." That was true, and I'd been kind of an asshole in my Margarita Santos Marquez days. Was that only 8 months ago? I said, "I assume I start tomorrow." She laughed and said, "Silly boy, you start in 4 hours. We work 4-hour shifts on a 3-shift rotation, 7 days a week, so get some sleep, you're going to need it." Then she turned and walked out of the ward. Her pantherish grace was only equalled by her forthright and resolute bearing. Veronica Chase was the kind of strong woman I'd always feared. There was no point in going back to my little sleeping space. So, I just sacked out on one of the cots. Instead of feeling exhausted and resentful at how I'd been treated, I was formulating a plan to prove to this woman that I was a person she could accept as a peer. It didn't seem like I'd closed my eyes for a minute when I was roused out of sleep by a female hand insistently shaking my shoulder. I said wearily, "Not now, Margarita. I need to sleep." That's when a woman's voice said in harsh, no-nonsense terms, "Hit the deck, soldier. Your shift is about to begin." I pried one eye open, and an angelic face was hovering over me. Was this heaven? It took a second to register where I was, and then it hit me. The woman was named Veronica, and she was there to introduce me to the rest of my life. I almost threw up. Ronnie was the circulating nurse. So I accompanied her on her rounds and took notes. There was no such thing as a workday at Santa Catalina. We did 4-hour shifts, slept for 4, and then repeated. The cycle went on every 24 hours. I did 3 shifts every day of the week. They'd had a meeting about me. There were originally 72 MDs among the internees, but disease and the Japanese had whittled that number down to 31. Doc Schaefer, the only board-certified surgeon, and Maud decided that I needed to prove myself from the bottom up as an orderly, and Doc Lewis was the attending who got stuck with me. Lewis was the oldest of the bunch. He had been a GP in Quezon City. He mainly did primary care, so he was low in the pecking order. He knew my story, and unlike the other doctors, Lewis was happy to take me under his wing. My new boss was an incisive old coot who cut through the bullshit and accepted no excuses. We had a heart-to-heart during my first shift, where he told me about his expectations. I was to follow orders and behave, or he would recommend I be given a job more appropriate to my capabilities and attitude, like being a honey dipper for the outdoor latrines. But he did it with a grandfatherly air. It was July and the tropical illnesses were widespread. People were getting sick in droves, and the wards started to fill up. So they promoted me from transcribing notes to assisting Ronnie in her nursing duties. That amounted to intake diagnosis and rounds, taking patients' vitals, and supervising whatever care Lewis or one of the other doctors prescribed. We'd had a severe dysentery outbreak just before the Angels arrived, which they began to address by cleaning up the camp, particularly the latrines. Of course, I got the assignment. They also started to enforce rules about hygiene. They formed groups to ensure that the drinking water stayed relatively sanitary. Within weeks, the dysentery cases fell sharply and people stopped dying. That didn't mean the wards weren't overloaded. Tropical diseases are inevitable in the Philippines, and mosquito-borne illnesses like malaria and dengue fever are widespread. But the Angels also delivered babies and treated people suffering from every form of accident or ailment. The latter gave me my first opportunity to earn a glimmer of respect from Ronnie. One day, a woman who was the wife of an American merchant sailor came into the clinic with a 10-month-old infant. The father was on a ship somewhere in the Pacific when the Japanese invaded. So, the woman was in the camp by herself, alone and scared. Her little girl had painful blisters all over her feet. We had set up an examining space using bedsheets near the building entrance. The woman and her child sat on a stool while Ronnie sat on another facing her. This case had puzzled her. We had a good supply of sulfur because that was the cure-all for the American military, and Ronnie had administered that. But the blisters kept spreading into a painful rash, and the mother was at the end of her rope with a crying, screaming kid. I tried to be Ronnie's faithful shadow for the first few weeks. Seen, but not heard. But I knew what the problem was, and I knew why Ronnie hadn't recognised it. Ronnie was a combat nurse. If the kid had the kind of problem she was used to, she would have identified and treated it. But Ronnie had only nursed Americans who ate a relatively healthy diet. She had no experience with the diseases common to Filipinos, and this mother had all the symptoms of something I recognised. I was standing behind Ronnie, secretly admiring her shapely ass. "Hey! I'm a guy!" I cleared my throat, and Ronnie turned and looked at me, irritated. She said brusquely, "I don't appreciate being interrupted when I'm with a patient." I said, "Can I ask Mrs. Dolowitz a couple of questions?" Before Ronnie could say no, I said to the woman, "Are you still breastfeeding the child?" She nodded. "Of course. What other nutrition did she have for her baby?" Ronnie said warningly, "Eric!" I persisted. "Do you have the same kind of blisters?" Ronnie had stopped bugging me and was sitting there looking pissed. The woman said, "No, I feel weak all the time and I can't remember things. I do have a lot of scaly skin, though." That was it. I said, "What are you eating, ma'am?" She said, "Mostly whatever I can scrounge. We don't have any money, so I eat what's available at the mess." That was rice gruel twice a day. I turned to Ronnie. She looked irritated but interested now and said, "Both of them have beriberi. You see it a lot here among the Tagalogs. But it's rare among Anglos because we have a much richer and more varied diet." I added, "It's a fatal thiamine deficiency. Mrs. Dolowitz has all the adult symptoms. Hers aren't as bad because she must have other food sources." I turned to the mother and said, "Have you eaten anything else?" The mother said, puzzled, "I've eaten some pigweed, we boiled it in a kettle." Weeds were a delicacy for starving people. I said, "That's it. I've seen this a lot with the poorer Filipinos. The kid has classic symptoms of childhood beriberi. She needs a big dose of B1 right away. It's in any leafy vegetable. Pigweed counts, but there's no way the mother would feed that to her." I added with urgency in my voice, "The mother has gotten some thiamine into her system, but it isn't getting through to her daughter in the breast milk. The poor little thing will be dead soon if we don't increase Mrs. Dolowitz's B1 uptake a lot. She needs fruit." Ronnie looked appalled and said, "Fruit!" I reached into my pocket and came out with a genuine Yankee dollar. I said, "Buy some mangoes from the people at the fence. Eat them, but you also need to give the juice to your daughter. If you do that, the symptoms will disappear in a couple of weeks. Just come back when you run out of money and I'll give you more." I knew $1 would buy her a lot of mangoes, but who knows? The mother looked at me like I'd handed her a chest full of gold doubloons. She said, wondering, "I can't take all your money." I laughed. I have a little bit more socked away. If she only knew how much more. I added, "We're all in this together and this will save your baby's life." Ronnie looked dumbstruck. Then a faint hint of respect came into those fabulous eyes. She said, embarrassed, "I should have thought of a thiamine deficiency. I was concentrating too much on the disease aspect." She added with a sly grin, "Maybe you're not useless after all." I said mildly, "Look, we're all tired and underfed. I saw beriberi in the clinics at Philippine General because we had a charity ward. You're an army nurse. There wouldn't be too many instances of that at Sternberg." Then I added in my friendliest voice, "We're all charity cases now, so we have to do the best we can with what we have." Luckily, it'll just take a few mangoes to fix Mrs. Dolowitz's problem." A hint of despair crept into Ronnie's sultry voice for the first time. She said, "They're all dying, and we don't have nearly enough of anything to save them. There's nothing I can do about it. All I can do is make their last days as easy as possible." Her beautiful eyes had tears in them. Unbelievable. This woman was taking personal responsibility for something she had no power over. It wasn't Ronnie's fault that we didn't have the essential medicines to treat the residents of that godforsaken place. She just cared too much, and it was rubbing off on me. The angels were doing the best they could, making do with nothing but makeshift medical interventions and raw dedication and courage. They didn't have access to effective medicines like quinine, which was bitterly ironic since quinine from the bark of the cinchona tree was readily available. We grew it on Mindanao and supplied it to the world. Now, even a little of that drug would save a lot of lives. I wanted to reach out and comfort my stalwart friend, but I knew I would lose a limb if I tried to put my arm around her. I was trying to decide what to say when the idea hit me like Saul on the road to Tarsus. I had a fortune stashed in my hut. I could get all of the quinine we needed. That sudden onset of altruism wasn't entirely due to Ronnie's beautiful face. My work with the angels was beginning to teach me that helping others was a reward in and of itself. Selflessness was a somewhat alien concept for me, but I was beginning to find it appealing. I must have blurted out the part about buying the quinine, because Ronnie looked at me like I had finally proven that I was as stupid as she thought I was. She growled, "How can you do that? We're isolated in here." I gave her a wink and said, "I have friends in low places. You ought to know that from seeing me in my younger days. Just put together a shopping list and I'll try to get whatever you need." I wasn't boasting. I'd stayed connected with my old pal Vincente. Vincente might have been a lounge lizard, just like me, but he was a native Filipino, half Tagalog and half Spanish. He would regularly visit the fence to see if I needed anything. He undoubtedly enjoyed flaunting his freshly pressed tropical attire as he handed me a few meagre scraps of food and some soap, for a $20 gold piece, of course. In the good old days, he'd kiss my ass, and I would let him have my leftovers. So he must have gotten a real kick from seeing the haggard skeleton I'd become. Vincente had nothing to fear from the Japanese, partly because, being a native, he was immune from any internment orders. But more importantly, he was plugged into the Filipino guerrilla network, and the Tagalogs had plenty of experience cutting the throats of foreign invaders, dating to our arrival in 1898. They simply returned to their old tricks as soon as the Japs arrived. The Tagalog guerrillas had more or less taken over the area surrounding Manila. The punishment was harsh if one was discovered. Still, one Filipino is pretty much indistinguishable from another, and the Japanese found it impossible to do anything about the growing menace. Teria Devoso was Vincente's cousin and the leader of the Hunters ROTC. That outfit was the most dangerous organized group in the Manila area. The odd name came from the fact that it was composed of former cadets at the Philippine Military Academy. They'd just headed for the jungle when the Japanese arrived. Hence, the next time Vincente came down to the fence, I surreptitiously passed him a note with a couple of gold double eagles rolled up inside. The message said, "The people in the Santo Tomas camp will die if we do not get access to medicine and medical supplies, particularly quinine tablets. Please help us. We will pay in gold for any medicine you can provide from this list." The list Ronnie had given me included quinine, ether, a wonder drug called aspirin that fought fever, and medical equipment like surgical kits and sterile dressings. Vincente nodded and said, "I'll get this to Adavoso, and he'll see what he can do." The next day I made my daily pilgrimage down to the fence. There was no Vincente. That wasn't very reassuring. I was searching for him among the Filipinos gathered there. That's when a kid detached himself from the group and strolled in my direction. There was nothing special about him. He was the type of classic street urchin you saw all the time, hustling for anything he could beg or steal in the streets of Manila. He said in a far too adult voice, "My name is Ernesto, senor. Can you give me some gold for this?" and he held up a large bottle containing what looked like quinine tablets. I said, "How do I know it's real?" The boy shrugged and said casually, "You need to give me 4 gold pieces to find out." I felt like I was wasting $80. But what option did I have? I reached through the fence and dropped 4 gleaming coins in the boy's grubby paw. He handed me the bottle. Then he turned, mounted a moth-eaten burro, and clip-clopped off toward the squalid tenement area that lines the passage. His parting words were, "I will bring you more tomorrow for 4 more gold pieces." I walked back to the clinic, puzzled. Were these things real? It was a big bottle, and late summer in the Philippines was mosquito season. So one ward was full of feverish, sweating people crying and moaning in agony. The harsh light hurt their eyes and the ward was darkened so that it looked like Hieronymus Bosch's rendition of hell. Plus, it stank to high heaven. Josie, of course, was the angel who'd volunteered for that horrendous duty. Ronnie, who was supposedly off shift, was there too. She was mopping brows, holding bedpans as they vomited blood, and administering whatever words of encouragement she could. I walked up to Josie and said respectfully, "Can I have a second of your time, Mama?" Josie looked at me, fatigued to the point where I had to wonder how she could still stand, and said impatiently, "What do you want, Eric? Can't you see I'm a little busy here?" I held up one of the pills and said, "Is this quinine?" Josie looked at me like she didn't appreciate being messed with. She took the pill with a long-suffering expression and held it up to examine the writing stamped on it. Then she turned to me and said, her voice full of urgency and wonder, "Where did you get this?" I said, "Is it quinine?" She said, "Yes. Do you have any more of it?" I held up the big bottle and said, "I can get more of it tomorrow if this is the real deal." Josie said in a voice full of jubilation, "Ronnie, come here! Look what Eric brought us." Ronnie sauntered over, looking none too pleased. She was beautiful and exhausted, with a lock of her thick ash-blonde hair hanging down over one eye. She said impatiently, "We're a little busy here, Eric. What do you want?" Josie handed her the pill and said, "Is this what I think it is?" Ronnie took it and held it up to the ray of light shining through the curtains. Then she turned to me questioningly. For the first time in our brief history, the woman looked awestruck. She said in a voice brimming with emotion, "You did it. I don't know how you did, but you've saved a lot of lives." Did I detect a hint of respect? Or maybe something else? And so my new role as Scrounger-in-Chief for the Santa Catalina Hospital began. Ernesto showed up the next day with a burlap bag full of bottles of quinine. It was enough to alleviate any of the camp's problems with malaria for at least the following year. That sack cost me over 1,000 in gold. But I'd lost that much at poker waiting for the Japanese to arrive. Over the course of several months, Ernesto brought other things, cans of ether, sterile dressings, and even aspirin, which did wonders with fevers. It cost another pile of gold coins. But you can't eat gold or use it to treat disease. I was appalled at how unselfish I'd become. It was disturbing. Then Vicente showed up at the fence Easter week of 43. He handed me a big monkey pod box. I said, "What's this?" He said, "Open it and see. One of our boys liberated this from the Japanese." I did, and inside was a suite of surgical instruments with a complete set of blades. I raised an eyebrow and looked at him questioningly. He said, "I remembered that one of your frauds was to pretend you were a surgeon. Well, here's all the kit you'll need to really be one. Happy Easter." I said, "How much do I owe you?" He laughed and said, "Nothing, it's a gift. Terry's boys lifted it from a Japanese field hospital. After they'd killed all of them, of course. We have no use for it. I thought of you." I didn't know what to make of it. Was Vicente calling my bluff, and why? I must have been a total asshole back then if he'd gone that far out of his way to remind me of my many former sins. I said as nonchalantly as I could, "Well, thanks. Maybe I'll get to use these things someday." That opportunity came sooner than I expected, but there's a story to it. Very early in my internment, I'd had a comfortable little bamboo and palm frond shack built for me in the open space on campus. Other wealthy people did the same thing, and soon all of the empty space was full of those huts. My shack was a cozy private spot where I could retreat when the heat and the crushing mass of humanity got to be too much. I'd originally built it out of sheer selfishness, but I'd begun sleeping there once I'd started my indentured servitude at the clinic. I would check in at the dorms each night for roll call, and then the guards would release me back to the clinic. The hut was a lot quieter and infinitely more comfortable than my sleeping space upstairs, and my rotations were geared so that my sleeping times were mainly in the day anyhow. I kept all of the food I could scavenge in the hut. It was hidden in the tiny trunk that I was allowed to bring with me when we were first interned. I suppose others knew about it. But everybody was watching everybody else, and there was a kind of camp code that said we shouldn't ever steal other people's food. So I wasn't concerned about leaving it when I was on shift. One scorching hot afternoon, I was dozing next to the trunk when it moved. I realised that somebody had crept stealthily in and was trying to get at my food. I jumped to my feet and shouted angrily, "Oh no, you don't!" There was a shriek and a scuttling noise. I yanked back the door curtain to let in some light, and to my utter astonishment, there was a little girl, cowering in fright against the far wall of the hut. She was a beautiful little thing, perhaps 8 or 9, weeping pitifully. My heart melted. I crouched in front of the snotty-nosed little miscreant and said in a joshing tone, "And what do you think you're doing, young lady?" She looked at me out of the biggest, bluest eyes and snivelled. "I'm sorry, mister, but I'm so hungry." I said gently, "Where's your mother? Doesn't she feed you? You get a ration twice a day, you know." She began to cry hard. I said, now really concerned, "What's the matter, sweetie?" She murmured through her tears, "Mommy died yesterday and Daddy was killed in the war." I said, shocked, "Wait a minute, you're telling me there's nobody to take care of you?" She blubbered, "Nobody, and I'm so scared." Then she catapulted herself onto my chest, threw her arms around my neck, and wept. I sat back on the floor holding a tiny blonde bundle of grief, while the poor little thing wailed like her heart was going to break. I said gently, stroking her hair, "Let's get you something to eat." I reached into my trunk and took out the big juicy mango that I had been saving for a special occasion. She instantly stopped crying, grabbed the mango and made it disappear, skin and all, in about 30 seconds. I said, "Easy. You'll make yourself sick." She produced a loud, satisfied belch and said, "Thank you." Then, with her little tummy full, she stood, formally extended her hand like her parents had no doubt taught her to do, and said, "My name is Melissa, but my friends call me Missy." "You can call me Missy. I'd like that." I took her tiny hand in mine and said, "Pleased to meet you, Missy. My name is Eric, and I'm going to take care of you from now on." Where the fuck did that come from? Lately, I'd found myself saying things that were simply not the old irresponsible me. But that statement was perhaps the most bizarre of them all. Even so, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd meant what I'd just said, and no force on earth would make me change my mind. This little angel was my concern now. The bond was instantaneous, as it always is with parent and child. I didn't have to waste time over-analysing the reasons why. It was just there. The fact was, this poor little thing needed somebody, and fate had pointed the finger at me. I knew that there was no way to avoid the responsibility, at least if I ever wanted to keep a shred of self-respect. I have no idea how a former libertine could fall so suddenly and totally into a willing lifetime obligation. It was inexplicable, not to mention illogical. But there was no doubt in my mind that I would sacrifice everything I had to keep this little girl safe and happy. It was a peculiar feeling, an instant and absolute sense of pure love for this fragile little creature. Maybe it's genetic. Humans have a prolonged period of helplessness compared to other animals. So, the nurturing instinct must be hardwired into our brains. I thought, I've got to talk to Ronnie. That was astonishing in and of itself, since I was pretty sure Ronnie hated me. But I also realized that she was the only person in the entire camp whose judgment I trusted. I said, "Come with me. I want us to go meet a special friend." I appeared at the nurses' quarters, holding the hand of a tiny blonde cherub. That provoked an immediate response from the ladies who were doing their washing outside the tent. One of them yelled mockingly over her shoulder, "Ronnie, he's here." Was our relationship that obvious? Ronnie came charging out of the tent with fire in their eyes. She'd already seen me through the window. Before she could get to me, I raised my hands in a gesture of surrender and said meekly, "I found her rummaging for food in my hut. Both parents are dead, and I want your advice." That stopped her in her tracks. Then she did an odd thing. She got an indescribable look of compassion on her lovely face as she knelt in the dirt next to the little girl and said, "What happened to your mommy, little girl?" Missy started to snivel again. She said through her tears, "Mommy's in heaven. That's what Ms. Miller told me." Ronnie immediately snapped into nurse mode. She said, "What's Mommy's last name, dear?" Missy sniffled and said, "Brady." Ronnie nodded and said under her breath, "Dengue fever." She stood and said to me, "She's an orphan, all right. It happened last night." I said, "Well, okay, then I'm her new daddy." Perhaps it was the child's vulnerability. She was caught up in matters that she couldn't and needn't understand. Maybe it was her innocence. Or it might have been the contrast between the brutality of her surroundings and the purity of her sweet little soul. Whatever it was, I knew that the buck stopped with me, and that was absolutely the way it was going to be. Ronnie said emphatically, "What makes you think I'm going to let somebody as irresponsible as you take care of a little girl? There are lots of other orphans in this camp. She'll have plenty of company." I understood Ronnie's thinking. The Angels had established a facility for kids who were in precisely the same situation as Missy. They had expert nurses doing the minding, and they were the right people to be doing that. But there was no way I was going to put my little girl in among a faceless herd of orphan children. She was my responsibility, and perhaps my salvation. Of that, I was absolutely sure. I might have lost my social standing, and maybe I wasn't the most useful person in that camp, but I was still a man of considerable means with all that represented in terms of leverage. "So," I said, in a voice that was loaded with menace, "you are not going to take this angel away from me. She will stay in my hut. She'll be safe and loved, and I have the wherewithal to make sure she's properly fed." Ronnie looked shocked. Maybe she'd underestimated me. It was clear that she still didn't trust me. Of course, why should she? She stood there looking at me contemplatively. Then she got a determined look on her beautiful face and said, "Let's take this to Maud." I said, "Fine." We walked to the clinic without saying a word. I wasn't going to change in my baffling new dedication to this little girl, and Ronnie wasn't going to let anybody as reckless as me take care of somebody that young and vulnerable. Missy just tripped along next to me, holding tightly to my hand. She was obviously very frightened, and she wasn't letting go. That cemented my resolve. My little cherub had no reason to be concerned, because for the first time in my self-centered life, I had met somebody I loved more than myself, and I was ready to defend this dear little thing to the death. It was an exhilarating feeling. My. What had become of the Eric Grayson of old? Maud was in a meeting with the doctors when we got to the Santa Catalina building. So, the three of us loitered at the entrance. Ronnie drove herself hard, but the Angels had settled into the camp, and they'd started to get into routines. So Ronnie had clearly taken some time off to wash her hair, and maybe put on a little lipstick. She was a devastatingly beautiful woman. She eyed me suspiciously and said, "What are you really up to, Eric? I don't believe this sudden attack of altruism." I gave her a crooked smile and said gently, "You have a right to be suspicious. I can't explain it. It's some kind of weird psychic connection. It hit me the minute I laid eyes on her. I knew instantly that I would do anything to protect her." I looked down at Missy, who was looking up at me with the sort of total trust that a child gives to a parent. Ron said with increasing warmth, "That's natural. They call it bonding, Eric." Then she added almost fondly, "What am I going to do with you? You keep escaping the pigeonholes I put you in. Maybe there's a decent, caring human being underneath all of that monumental ego." That was when Maud emerged from the room. She was with Schaefer and the other docs. They all gave Ronnie a friendly smile and then looked curiously at me standing there holding a little girl by the hand. Ronnie said, "Got a minute, Maud?" while the rest exited the building. Maudie turned with a puzzled look on her face and said, "What do you need, Veronica?" Maudie would never use anything but a proper name. Ronnie said, "This little girl was orphaned last night. Her father commanded the 31st Infantry at Bani Guirol, you remember that one?" Maud nodded ruefully. The Angels indeed were a band of sisters. They'd seen and endured things I couldn't imagine. Ronnie went on, "He was killed there, and her mother died last night. Eric here wants to take care of her instead of putting her into our orphan care. He has that hut of his, and he obviously has the money. The question is whether you think he can be trusted." Then she added with an odd look on her face as if she had just realised something, "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm beginning to think that he can." Maud Davison was the sharp edge of a Damascus steel blade, but the person underneath was a deeply caring woman. She looked at me with what almost resembled respect and said, "Have you grown up a little bit, sonny boy? Can you manage that much responsibility?" She added, "You've done pretty well so far. Getting us those supplies was a lifesaver. We were talking about letting you finish your residency a couple of minutes ago. But taking care of this little girl along with your regular duties is about as much as I think you can manage. So, what is it? Do you want to start being a doctor, or do you want to be a daddy?" And that answer would have been obvious if she'd asked the question 24 hours earlier. It was just as clear now. I looked down at Missy, who was staring up at me, her eyes full of little girl love, and said without hesitation, "I choose her, thank you very much." Maud appeared shocked and Ronnie actually gasped. Maud said incredulous, "You'd trade the opportunity to get out of bed pan patrol for more responsibility minding a kid?" I nodded my head vigorously. She looked at me with grudging admiration and drawled, "Well, maybe you've become a man after all." Then Maud got a mysterious look on her face and turned to Ronnie. She said, "Are you ready for another duty?" Both of us knew what she was about to ask. Ronnie said with conviction and something else in her voice, "Absolutely." And that's the story of how an ex-profligate, a tough army nurse and a sweet little girl became a quasi-family. There was no way Maud would let me care for another human being without direct supervision, at least at first. So, Ronnie was around the shack as much as I was. In fact, she was only with the other Angels when she was on duty or when Missy and I were asleep. Missy was always with me. Most of the time she accompanied me to work. At the clinic, she was a little ray of sunshine, a kind of mascot of sorts for the nurses and patients. She was always happy and full of innocent good cheer. She brought joy to sick people and I was proud of her. I had gotten a few decent rugs and Missy and I slept on those. I bought food at the fence to supplement the morning and evening rations, and I even got a new dress for Missy. Pleasing her was my obsession. And if you think I was getting any ideas about Ronnie, you don't have a clue about what it's like to work in stifling heat and the occasional monsoon on 1,500 calories a day. The Japanese had reduced our ration again. So, there was nothing remotely romantic about our relationship. That is, if you discount the fact that a man and a woman taking care of a child together is almost the entire point of the exercise. When I wasn't at their clinic, I was either scrounging for food or lying around like a dead fly. I tried to spend quality time with my little girl. Ronnie, of course, showed up to tutor her in her off time. My gorgeous friend did her duty even in her sleep, which she plainly didn't get much of. Even though she'd made me choose, Maud had arranged for me to work with Schaefer during some basic surgical procedures. Schaefer wasn't a bad guy, and he knew his stuff when it came to cutting and sewing, which is what surgical practice amounts to. I had begun the habit of tying knots in various gauges of thread in my pants pocket, using one hand. It was good practice if I ever had to operate. I'd also been reviewing human anatomy with anybody who wanted to talk, including Ronnie. She was as knowledgeable as she was tough. I had been observing Schaefer for a couple of weeks when he told me to scrub in. One of the older men in the camp was suffering from cholecystitis and needed his gallbladder removed. It was a simple procedure. I'd witnessed it dozens of times back in the halcyon days at Philippines General. It's a 6-inch cut on the right side, just below the ribs, retraction of the muscles. And voila! You take out that little sac lying beneath the patient's liver, not more than 2 hours from start to finish. Erlene Black was the Angels' sole nurse anaesthetist. She was seated at the patient's head passing the gas. She was a woman who was ungodly precise, which is who you want mixing and controlling the various anaesthetics. I expected her to be there. But the surgical nurse was a shock. I looked across the patient and there were a pair of calm, grey E's above the mask. They were focused on me, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Morning, nurse." And Ronnie said formally and politely, "Good morning, doctor." Nurse Veronica Chase had not scrubbed for a single operation in all the time that I'd known her. Of course, once the operation began, it was obvious that she was a remarkable surgical assistant. Her actions were knowledgeable and efficient. The instruments just appeared in Schaefer's hand the instant he asked for them. We got to the point where the little pear-shaped sac was revealed, and Schaefer said, "Take it from here, Eric." I nearly fainted. I was about to protest when I looked at those formidable eyes, and they were willing me to proceed. It stiffened my spine. I couldn't let her down. I said, trying to sound authoritative, even if my heart was in my throat, "Suture." The surgical thread appeared in my hand. I tied the bile duct. I said, "Scalpel," and the right gauge instrument smacked into my palm. The cutting and closing took 45 minutes. Nurse Chase anticipated my every move. She was superb. Doc Schaefer said admiringly, "I haven't seen you work in a long time, Ronnie. You're still the best scrub nurse in the Philippines. Why'd you abandon the OR?" Ronnie got a look of disgust and said grimly, "I just couldn't take it after all the meatball surgery we did on Corregidor. Plus, I'm helping out a lot more doing general nursing." Schaefer looked sympathetic. He said, "I understand. I heard it was very bad there. You worked 24-hour shifts at the end, didn't you?" Ronnie said wearily, "It wasn't the shifts. I'd done surgeries that long at Sternberg. It was the sheer futility of sweating by battle lantern to save a life, and then finding out the guy was killed a week later. It happened way too often, and it finally got to be too much." Schaefer said gently, "That must have been hard." Ronnie gave a quick little nod. Tears filled her eyes. I just looked at her in stunned awe. Schaefer added, curious, "So what brought you out of retirement?" I was hoping she'd say, "Eric did." Instead, she said, "I was bored." She wasn't going to give me a break. Schaefer turned to me and said, "That was excellent work, Eric. Your cutting was adequate, but I've never seen such superb suturing." I almost blushed like a virgin. After all, I wasn't always playing with myself when I had my hand jammed down in my pants pocket. Ronnie said directly to me, "That was clever work, Doctor. I think you're actually ready to make a difference." Why were those words so important to me? I said pointedly, "We make a good team." Ronnie coloured and nodded. Was she human after all? My little cherub was asleep in the general ward when I came out of the operating room, which in its earlier incarnation had been the clinic's administrative office. Sally Durrett was the circulating nurse on duty. She was gazing down at Missy like a person taking a refreshing drink of water. My sweet and innocent little daughter had that effect on weary and hopeless people. I smiled at Sally. She said calmly, "She's been sleeping all the time you were in there." I bent down to wake her with a kiss on her forehead. Her eyes opened and she looked at me with the faith that a child has in its parent and said, "Hi, Daddy." She'd been calling me that more and more. I liked it. In May of 43, the Japanese set up a second internment camp at Los Baños. Initially, 800 internees were sent there to ease the crowding at Santo Tomas. The war was going badly for the Japs now. So they had begun interning everybody, even the very elderly, the missionaries, and the clergy, who'd been heretofore exempt. Soon, Los Baños started to mirror the conditions at Santo Tomas. All of the Navy nurses were transferred to Los Baños, they soon immediately to be known as the Sacred 11. Some of the docs were also sent along. The Japs chose them randomly, and unfortunately, they picked Schaefer. That left me as the only person with any surgical training in the entire camp. I was genuinely appalled when I got the word from Maud. Hell, I was no surgeon. I mean, seriously. I wasn't even a doctor. I was summoning the courage to tell Maud that she was making a big mistake. That was when Ronnie sat down next to me. She said gently, "This is your moment, Eric. Nobody will blame you if you take the easy road. But you won't be able to live with yourself if you do." She sighed and added, "Pretty girls get all of the breaks, but beauty fades, and once it's gone there's nothing left." So, I decided to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it was. I never regretted it, and I will be with you every step of the way if you choose to stand and fight. Where did all that wisdom come from? What had happened in this woman's past to make her so smart and strong? I said sheepishly, "You really think I can do it?" She gave me a lopsided grin and said, "God help me for saying this. But I have faith in you." For the next several months it was just me and the best scrub nurse in the Philippines. Fortunately, for the health and safety of the camp's residents, there was very little call for my services. People who might have needed significant surgery just died. I did some stitching and the occasional C-section, nothing any of the angels couldn't have done in their sleep, and I gradually improved. We had a major typhoon at the end of 43 which flattened my shack. After that, Missy and I were permitted to sleep at the clinic because Maud and Earl Carroll convinced the Japanese that I had to be available. I'd reinforced that decision with a few of my dwindling supply of gold coins. Time slowed for everybody. We lived in a fog of basic survival. Our only goal was to make it to the next day. We had no energy. Even the most straightforward task was daunting. Mostly I did my basic patient care duties, the familiar things I had done for the past 2 years. But it was getting harder to concentrate, and mistakes were made. Then something happened that convinced me once and for all that my new life had some meaning. Missy was sleeping next to me. It was the middle of the day, but we slept when we could. I heard her cry. I said, "What's the matter, sweetie pie?" She said, "My tummy hurts, Daddy." Everybody had digestive problems by that point. It's what happens when you're living on almost no food. Still, her pain was my pain, so I said, "Let me get you something to eat," and dipped into my stash. There was nothing left except a couple of chunks of stale bread. I gave them to her and said, "Eat this, and I'll try to buy you something better at the fence." That was getting more difficult because the Japs had begun patrolling the perimeter to stop the Filipinos from selling us food. Missy whined, but she ate the bread. We settled back to sleep, and perhaps 15 minutes later, she began to cry again. I said, "Does your stomach still hurt?" The bread should have helped. She snivelled. "That's not where it hurts, Daddy. It hurts here." She stood up and pointed to her lower right abdomen. A chill passed over me. I pressed the place where Missy had indicated, and she yelped. I felt her head, and it was feverish. One of the angels, Jean Kennedy, was nearby. I said, "Jean, come over here a second, would you?" Jean was reading a patient's chart. She made a couple of notes and walked over to us. I said, "Could you please confirm a diagnosis for me? Missy says that she has pain in the right lower quadrant of her abdomen." Jean got a guarded look and said, "Lie down, honey." Missy lay back and Jean did a practitioner's trained assessment using the tips of her fingers, poking in certain spots and asking, "Does it hurt here?" When she got to the spot that we both dreaded, Missy cried out in pain. Jean looked meaningfully at me. I said, "Get Ronnie." My beautiful friend seemed utterly exhausted as she helped me move my little angel into the improvised operating room. Her formerly full and buxom body was like a scarecrow's, but her eyes were as focused and potent as ever. She did the sterile prep as I scrubbed up. Then I waited while she prepared the instruments. Not a word was said as Erlene calculated the anesthesia ratios. We were all moving like we were wading through mud, at the absolute limits of our physical endurance. It is utterly insane for a surgeon to operate on his own child. The emotional baggage amplifies the stress beyond measure, but there was no other option. Thanks to Vincente's mocking gift, I had a complete set of surgical instruments. Ronnie was a master surgical assistant. We could do this. We would beat this together. I realised this was the quintessential fulcrum on which my life teetered. The potential for error was high, yet the stakes were far too critical to make a mistake. So I barricaded myself inside the island fortress of my mind. Every thought was banished. I stopped thinking. I only saw and acted. I made the incision in Missy's precious skin. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. The blood welled, and Ronnie cleared it with deft, precise moves. We were working very cautiously, too debilitated from hunger and stress to move quickly. Ronnie's skillful hands worked the retractors, and the evil thing was revealed squatting there like a malevolent toad, swollen and infected. The proper instruments appeared in my hand by Ronnie's magic. I did the simple suture and cut. Ronnie meticulously cleansed the area, as I did a painstakingly delicate removal. The close was routine. I looked at the clock. Appendectomies are typically a 45-minute procedure. It had been 2.5 hours. I glanced across the table at my stalwart friend and she was crying. Erlene was weeping at the head. We left the patient on the table to recover. We had no gurney to move her, and we didn't need the room. Then, as I turned to congratulate both angels, it came rushing at me like an express train out of a tunnel. My vision blurred and I collapsed on the floor, out colder than that proverbial mackerel. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been an hour. I came back to consciousness with a body pressed on mine and a beautiful weeping face hovering over me. I said, puzzled, "What happened?" Not intelligent, but I was still pretty out of it. When she realised that she had been lying half on top of me, she looked momentarily embarrassed. Then she snapped into nurse mode and said, "You passed out after the operation. We didn't know what had happened, so Erlene went to get Josie and I was just keeping an eye on you." That's when I said it. The crushing tension of what we'd just done combined with the proximity of that beautiful face made me say it. But I was glad I did. She had called me names, she had inspired and supported me, she had given me encouragement in my darkest moments, and just now she had helped me save my precious little girl's life. She could laugh at me and tell me how foolish I was. I didn't care. I had to blurt it out. I said simply and honestly, "I love you." I had been thinking about it for over a year, and it was the only thing in this hellhole I knew for sure was true, besides my love for Missy. Ronnie reacted as if I had hit her. She rose slowly and stood there staring at me, anguished and confused. I added calmly, "Yes, I love you. I have nothing to say beyond that. We probably won't survive this place and I have no expectations or intentions. But before we die, I want you to know that I love you." She finally said, "I don't know what to say, Eric." I said, "Don't say anything. You don't need to. I'm not looking for anything from you. I just need you to know that I finally understand what a genuine connection with another human being feels like." Then I paused and added bashfully, "You taught me a lot, Veronica Chase." I'd like to say that a long and passionate affair followed, but that would be ultra unrealistic and stupid given our situation. The Angles fought on valiantly, never budging an inch, but the only cure for malnutrition is food and we didn't have any of that stuff. We'd been growing vegetables in any arable space. But then, in early 45, the Japanese confiscated all of it for their own troops. When the Japs did that, all remaining hope went out of us. Now, there were almost as many angels lying in hospital beds as there were angels attending to patients. I worked side by side with Ronnie, as awkward as that might have been given what had transpired between us. Not another word was ever said about my unfortunate admission. Missy never left my side. She was the last flickering light in the all-consuming darkness, bringing a child's promise of hope to the patients. We didn't have rehabilitation facilities, so my brave little kitten just lived with the pain. I used up the last of my cash to buy aspirin for her. At night I would hold her, rock her, and tell her it would be okay. But I knew that I was lying. We were all going to die. Then an ironic thing happened. The first hint that my life was going to change was when that flight of Japanese planes passed over the Manila hotel. Well, it happened again like a harbinger of hope. We were going about our business late in January, when we heard the sound of powerful aircraft engines and flight after flight of gleaming fighters swept low over the camp. But instead of a meatball, those planes had a white star on a blue field. The Americans were coming. Then, 2 days later, we heard explosions and the rattle of machine gun fire next to the compound gate. There was a loud crash, and a green tank with a white star and Battle in Basic painted on its side burst through the heavy doors and into the compound. The cavalry had arrived. Specifically, a Sherman tank from the 44th Battalion of the US 1st Cavalry. I was standing on the steps of the clinic holding Missy's hand as the internees erupted into spontaneous cheers. 4 more Shermans followed, and the accompanying infantry quickly spread out into the compound. The internees were shouting and trying to hug every dog face as they arrived, but there was still work to be done. The Japanese guards had fled into the education building, where they used the 200 people trapped with them as human shields. I saw Carol and the interpreter Stanley go into the building and come out with a couple of Japanese officers. There was more negotiation outside the building, which featured one of the Japanese being shot by an American guard. The story was that he reached for a grenade. Anyhow, after backing and forthing for an hour or so, the Japanese all appeared single file and walked out of the camp. We were officially in the hands of the US military. It was pathetically anticlimactic. We had spent 37 months in painful confinement, longing for this moment. And when it finally arrived, we just stood there. No celebration, no fireworks, just 3,200 starving, exhausted people milling around on a hot Manila night. There was a war going on. So, Missy and I couldn't just hail a cab up to Makati. In fact, we stayed at Santo Tomas for an additional month and a half while they sorted out the Japanese. Once MacArthur had finished congratulating himself in front of the cameras, oh, and the angels as well, they were all assembled and trucked away. That was the second week after the liberation. They were going back to the States for a hero's welcome, whether they wanted it or not. They certainly got a hero's departure. Ronnie gave me a forlorn wave as their truck swung out of the compound and onto the Calle Dapitan. She was riding with Jean and Sally, but previously she'd tracked me down in the chaos of that first night of freedom, and we'd had a heart-to-heart conversation. I was sitting in an upholstered chair that I'd dragged out of the education building when Ronnie appeared in the doorway of the clinic. I'd brought it over so I could rock my little angel before she went to bed. Missy was lying on a cot in front of me now, and we were talking. We had just eaten our fill of spam and beans from the army mess. I had slimmed down from a fit 177 to a 108-pound skeleton on the Santo Tomas guaranteed weight loss plan. Hence, spam was an Epicurean feast. Missy had fared a little better because I'd given her most of my food toward the end, but she was still painfully skinny, and her appendix scar was not healing well due to malnutrition. That had been the subject of several of my worst nightmares. But it was behind us now. She could get the treatment she needed, including a new wonder drug called penicillin. Missy noticed Ronnie first. She hopped out of the cot and ran to give her a hug. I rose from the chair to greet her, and Ronnie said, "Sit down, Eric, there's something we need to talk about." I gestured to a nearby table and we sat. I said to Missy, "Go lie back down in your cot, kitten. Miss Ronnie and I have something important to talk about." She went skipping off without a care in the world, which was not exactly my case. I said as casual as I could, "So what do you want to talk about, my friend?" Ronnie looked grim. She said, "Do you remember that little moment we had after you passed out?" I said lightly, "I assume you're referring to my declaration of love for you. Well, it's still on the table if you're interested." I gave her a breezy grin. I knew she wasn't serious. Ronnie looked even more uneasy. She said, "Did you ever wonder whether I was married?" Married? Seriously? The thought never entered my mind. I don't know why it hadn't. Veronica Chase was a once-in-a-lifetime woman. I said, hoping the meaning was clear. "I told you that because that's the way I feel about you. Honestly, there's nothing more than that. So, your marital status is immaterial to me. I see you as an epitome of womanhood, not a romantic target." Ronnie blushed. It was an endearing trait. She was gorgeous, even while on the brink of starvation. She said, "Life's easy when you look like me. It isn't anything you earn. It's just genetics. But people treat you like you're special. So I grew up expecting everything and giving back nothing. The term is over-entitled. But the more accurate description would be spoiled brat." I said, grinning. "That sounds familiar." Ronnie gave me a look like she wanted me to just shut up and listen. She said, "I was a nurse cadet when I married William Chase. It was June of '39. We met at a dance at Kirkland Field. He was a lieutenant colonel and the commander of the B-17 squadron based there. I was 21. She added wistfully, "He was a lot older than me, very good-looking, and he just swept me off my feet. To say that our early married life was passionate would be an understatement." Then her face hardened and she said, "Bill was transferred to the Philippines with the 19th Bomb Group in November of 1940. I followed in February of '41. I was an ANC second lieutenant by that point, and an ORTA perioperative nurse specialist. That's a valuable area of expertise in the surgical wards. So, it was easy to wrangle a transfer to Sternberg." She sighed and added, "I got to the Philippines too late. Bill was a handsome flyer with a great line, and by the time I'd arrived, he'd already had several flings. He didn't even try to hide them. He said that's what all of the flyboys did." Heavens, that this was getting delightfully juicy. Ronnie was becoming more and more upset as she talked. We constantly fought, real blowouts. And he finally told me that he was what he was, and he didn't plan to change. So, I'd better accept it. That little tidbit no doubt meant that Ronnie wasn't married any longer. I tried and failed to put on a sympathetic face. She, as usual, read my mind and added acerbically, "I know what you're thinking, but what I'm trying to tell you is that after that ultimatum, I decided to not be any more faithful to Bill than he was to me." I couldn't see the self-sacrificing woman I knew straying off the reservation, but it was a different time and place, and people are human. Moreover, they can change. I was living proof of that. I said lightly, "Oh well, that was how things were back then." Then I hesitated and added incredulously, "Was that only 4 years ago? It seems like a century." Ronnie was getting frustrated. She was trying to confess, and I wasn't giving her minor indiscretion the significance she thought it deserved. Of course, back then, flaming affairs were my stock in trade. She said, "I won't bore you with the details, but the ending was heartbreaking and a turning point for me. Bill was the first pilot killed in his group. He was trying to get his bomber off the ground when the Japanese shot it down." She looked sad and added, "It was so Bill, always leading from the front." Then her face turned angry. She huffed, "When I got the news, I was totally devastated. But my lover was overjoyed. He told me that it was the best thing that could ever happen, because then I would be all his." She added with revulsion and self-loathing, "I mean, I'd just lost my husband. Bill might have been a womanizer, but but he did his duty and paid the ultimate price, while this worthless piece of human trash was sneaking around seducing me. Even worse, I was stupid and weak enough to fall for it. Ronnie took my hand in hers. It was the first time we had ever intentionally touched. This was very important to her. She said with bitterness, "I finally saw Giles for what he was, a self-absorbed, scheming bastard whose only talent was corrupting anything he touched. I also realised that I had sacrificed my honour and principles for something as banal as revenge. The guilt nearly killed me." "Giles?" I said incredulously. "Are you talking about Giles Pemberton?" She said, preoccupied, "Yes, do you know him?" The coincidence wasn't as incredible as it might seem. Manila is a big city, but its Anglo population was relatively small and insular. Giles had no doubt seen Ronnie somewhere, and her remarkable beauty would have been irresistible to a jackal like him. I chuckled and said ruefully, "We have a lot in common." Then I told her the story of Margarita's duplicitous exit on the Philippine clipper. I added, "Margarita saw men strictly as a means to an end." Ronnie said thoughtfully, "She was an uncommonly beautiful woman. I remember her from the party the night before the Japanese bombed Clark Field. That was the day Bill was killed." So, Ronnie was indeed the woman in the blue evening gown. I remember thinking then that she was the only female in Manila I would trade Margarita for. I said sarcastically, "I wonder what Margarita and Giles have gotten up to while we were starving." Ronnie said, still distracted, "The rumour on Bataan was that the Japanese shot up the Philippine clipper when it stopped at Wake Island. I didn't hear how that turned out." I laughed and said, "I'm sure those two survived. Only the good die young." She laughed. Then her serious look returned. She said, "You take a step back from yourself when you see who you actually are, and you do a lot of thinking about how to redeem yourself." I said, "Amen and hallelujah." Ronnie gave me a grim smile and said, "I realised that I was a woman without substance, a pretty face whose moral perspective had been distorted by her own ego. I was probably a lot like your Margarita in that respect." I said angrily, "She wasn't my Margaret. She wasn't anybody's woman." Ronnie gave me a sunny smile and added, "Neither am I." She continued, "I told Giles what a cowardly worm I thought he was, and then I totally committed myself to serving others. That's why I volunteered to go with the army when it withdrew to Bataan. I couldn't just sit it out at Sternberg." She looked both sad and resolute as she said, "Nursing wounded men in all that terrible chaos was uplifting and meaningful. And the more I gave to my patients, the more I got back in terms of a sense of personal integrity and self-respect. It was a humble act of contrition for my prior sins." She looked pensive for a moment and added, "Ironically, as conditions got worse on Corregidor, and the harder I drove myself in the nightmare of the Malinta tunnel, the more at peace I felt. I suppose all of the fear and physical pain was my form of absolution." She hesitated for a moment like she was thinking, then added, "My point is that the woman you see before you reconstructed herself out of the ashes of her former failed self." Then she looked at me with her first genuine affection and said, "You've done the same thing. You've become a caring person. I can see that in how you treat this little child." She nodded toward Missy. Then she added, "And I can also see your redemption in the way that you have chosen to do what's right, no matter the difficulty or physical consequences." Then she paused again like she was deciding whether to throw the dice. She sighed and added, "And that's the reason why I fell hopelessly in love with you." I'd been brutalized and starved for 3 miserable years, and yet I would willingly go through it all over again just to hear those words. I said tentatively, "If I love you and you love me, does that mean we have a future together?" Ronnie gave me a mournful look, nodded and said, "Until next week. That's when they're shipping us back to the US for some kind of publicity stunt." It was late November in Manila, meaning the temperature was a mere 80 degrees, and we were presently in between monsoons. I was sitting on the front porch in the humid tropical air, gazing out over Manila Bay and trying to catch a breeze. It's funny how life twists and turns. 5 years ago this time, Margarita and I were making plans to attend the big December 7th pre-Christmas blowout at the Manila Hotel. That era was gone forever, like the age of the dinosaurs. In August of '45, we got the word that the Japanese had surrendered. It was some kind of wonder weapon called an A-bomb. I didn't know what an A-bomb was, and I'd probably never hear of it again. But it finally returned peace to my world. So, I was grateful. The nightmare was truly over. Missy and I lived in a tent city from February to April '45, while the army fought one of the bloodiest urban battles since Stalingrad. That was mainly in Intramuros. So, Santo Tomas was relatively safe. After they chased the Japs out of the area, we hitched a ride up to the family home. There, I found to my utter amazement and delight that the place was untouched thanks to some nameless Japanese general who'd appropriated it for his headquarters. The house was a mess, but it was heaven compared to the situation we'd been in for the past 3 years. Of course, the Filipino staff was gone, and my folks had fled to Honolulu on one of the last ships before the invasion. Now it was just the two of us all by ourselves. Missy and I set up camp in the parlour while I put our life back in order. She would have nightmares if I didn't sleep near her. So we sacked out for a couple of months on my parents' hideous overstuffed couches, she on one and me right next to her on another. My kitten had gained some of her weight back, and the appendix scar had healed. She was always a sweet, cheerful little bird, and I might add that her happy soul had brightened the lives of a few hopeless people, maybe even enough to save a few lives. I'd taken some time to inventory my circumstances after the Japanese left. The good news was that I was still rich and likely to become a lot richer. My old man had transferred most of our family fortune to American banks when he fled to Hawaii. So, it was still available for me to draw on. Better yet, the US was about to drop a massive bag of cash in Grayson & Son's lap as part of rebuilding the Philippines. The retreating Japanese had looted our warehouse facilities, but due to their strategic value, some of the new government largesse was earmarked to rebuild and restock them. The Filipino workers were still there, and the Anglo managers were getting back into shape after their 3-year vacation in Santo Tomas. My dad's right-hand man, Mike Barnes, had survived, and he'd told me that it would be business as usual by '47. My dad had decided to stay in Hawaii, which left me as the nominal head of the company in loco parentis. Then he abruptly died, which made me the new owner. That was early in '46. At least he'd lived to see the end of the war. Since my dad was gone and there was never going to be another son, I arranged for Barnes to come in as a full partner. It was Grayson and Barnes now. Mike was 20 years older than me and a solid guy. He knew our business. I didn't. So, he would make the money and I could devote myself to an idea that had been kicking around in my head since I left Santo Tomas. I'd gotten a taste for doctoring. As a result, I was negotiating with the Philippine Board of Medical Examiners about what 3 years of unofficial residency at Santo Tomas amounted to in terms of getting me licensed. My appointment with their Board of Examination was set for mid-January '47. Fortunately, it was mainly composed of doctors who had spent time with me in the camp. In fact, Lewis was the head of the board. So, my future looked bright, except in one respect. To my utter dismay, I'd discovered that the rest of the female world didn't measure up to Lieutenant Veronica Chase ANC. So, it was either her or nobody. The problem was that I didn't have her address, and there was no way to contact her. The Angels were the largest collection of American women ever held as POWs. Hence, they were an absolute PR bonanza, and the army didn't want anybody talking to them until they were shipped home to drum up business for the war. The US knew that the Angels were a valuable commodity. I mean, seriously. They'd made 3 movies about them during their captivity. Of course, none of the Angels knew about that since Santo Tomas featured starvation, not movie nights. And those saintly women were too busy saving people's lives anyhow. I'd written the army asking about Ronnie, but they must have been too busy dealing with the aftermath of World War II to respond to a lovelorn ex-POW. I had pretty much given up hope of ever seeing her again when she magically reappeared in my life. Well, in reality, her appearance wasn't physical, but it was painful nonetheless. Like all little girls, Missy loved horses. So, I took her to the Cine Real down in Manila proper to see a little kid named Elizabeth Taylor in a movie called National Velvet. Taylor was an up-and-coming English child actress who at 12 was just a year older than Missy. So my kitten could relate. They always ran a few of those Parthy newsreels before the film, and lo and behold. One of them was a story about a visit by a few of the Angels to the Paramount Studios in late '45. The festive atmosphere was obviously faked. Louise Ancheeks and Millie Dalton couldn't have looked more ill at ease shaking hands with Ray Milland, and the stage shot of Bertha Dworsky and Jane Wyman was like two strangers standing together at a bus stop. Then I saw Ronnie self-consciously holding a 6-gun. She had gained back most of her weight, and with her hair done and her makeup on, she was out of this world gorgeous. My problem was that the love of my life was in a clearly staged, corny, romantic embrace with an incredibly handsome cowboy. And from the expression on the guy's face, he was in lust. It was shocking. My heart fell out of my chest and lay beating on the floor amongst all the spilled popcorn and discarded gum. Fortunately, it was dark in the theatre, because Missy would have been upset if she'd seen my grief. Losing Ronnie to a Hollywood cowpoke was poetic justice. I had used my good looks in precisely the same fashion, but naive and foolish me, I'd thought that she was my future. I'd counted on her, and I had been dead, as in nearly deceased, wrong. It put a cloud over all of my good fortune. We all like to think that life's one continuous river. I mean, it's reassuring to wallow in the predictable routines of living, but it doesn't work that way, does it? The life changes we encounter are more like going from one strange room to another. What I mean is, all of life's dichotomies are one-way events. Single, married, no children, children, working, retired, even alive or dead. They are part of your life, but each is actually a new reality, and each of those realities has different rules and circumstances. So, your ability to adapt is critical. Seriously, you're in one situation, and that's your reality. Then things change and you're in a new one. And the next reality might not be anything that you ever anticipated or were prepared for. For instance, my reality prior to December 8th, 1941, was a whole lot different than the reality of 1 year later, and there was no going back to the way things were. Ronnie and I were together because that was our circumstance. Now we were apart due to conditions beyond our control. It would have been different if the army hadn't whisked her away, but that was the undeniable fact of the matter. I was sure that she loved me as much as I loved her, but that's not the direction the currents of our lives took us, and my happiness going forward was going to rely on my ability to adapt to that simple truth. So, I mourned her for a couple of months, but I had a little girl to take care of. That was my new reality, and you suck it up for the people you love. Then something that Ronnie had told me percolated to the top of my brain. Your future lies in what you have, not what you don't have. I still had Missy, and I had a future as a doctor. The truth had always been right there in front of me. I'd just obsessed too much about the past to see it. So, I stopped grieving my lost love and began to deal with the new facts. I had more money than I could spend and a lot of time on my hands. Hence, why not devote my life to operating free clinics like the one at Santa Catalina for the Filipinos? It was a way to give back, and frankly, they deserved it. Schaefer had the gravitas and reputation to head up the project, so I tracked the old boy down and laid out my proposal. Los Banos had been tough on him, and my idea seemed to give him new life. And speaking of giving, I also had another important project on the front burner. In the weeks before Missy's 12th birthday, there was a flurry of construction, and a mysterious new structure began to appear in the meadow, just down the hill from the main building. Missy was curious, but she never asked. Maybe the little mink suspected something. She loved national velvet, which inspired me to buy her a horse. Naturally, she named it Pie, as in piebald. The creature wasn't, but that didn't matter. That was the name of Elizabeth Taylor's horse. The beast was delivered in the dark of the night before Missy's birthday. Then that morning, I took Missy down to the new shed along with Ernesto, who I'd hired as a groom. I'd personally tracked him down for the task. I figured if the kid could take care of a burrow in a Pasig slum, he could take care of a horse in a McCarty mansion. The barn also had a second, smaller stall for Buttercup. I owed the old guy for all the trips he'd made with our life-saving medical supplies. Missy's little girl's shrieks of delight were only matched by her tears as she said over and over again, "Thank you, thank you." My heart expanded to fill the natural universe. This giving back thing might catch on. Missy's birthday was on the 1st of October of 46, and by late November, she had already become adept at riding, at least according to the Filipino riding master I'd hired to teach her. More importantly, she took care of Pie with the same dedication that Ronnie had shown her patience, which brought me back to thinking about my lost love for the 1,000,000th time. I was doomed to a bachelor life because only Ronnie haunted the empty corridors of my heart. For all I knew, she could be married again, or maybe living the life of a movie queen in Beverly Hills. Whatever the situation, she was gone for good. Of course, I had thought about other women. I was still relatively young, wealthy, and single, and I was as good-looking as ever, with the same sense of style. Consequently, I got plenty of invitations to Manila society events. But my heart knew what it had to have. So the whole exercise was pointless, and I'd stopped going. I was sitting there on that hot, humid day thinking about all that had transpired in my life when another door opened. The mansion was on an elevation looking down on the city to the northwest. From there, I could see traffic coming up McCarty Avenue from the Mandaluyong Bridge. A black Ford turned onto Real Drive and proceeded slowly up the long, winding gravel driveway toward my house. I was curious since nobody ever visited me. My old friends thought I had lost my mind when I turned up with a kid. They just assumed Missy was mine, which she was in every way except biologically. The car stopped and Schaefer got out. He had aged at Los Banos, and I rushed down to help him up the steps. He was close to 30 years older than me, so he'd become something of a mentor. He plopped into a plantation chair on our expansive front porch, and I said, curious, "What brings you here, Dieter?" That was when we were both distracted by a loud whoop as Missy and Pie took off across the lawn at a full gallop. We both watched her disappear around the back of the house. Schaefer said matter of fact, "Everybody remembers her. They call her the littlest angel." I just glowed with pride. It had gotten hotter, so I asked the houseboy to bring us a pitcher of lemonade. It took a minute. We gazed silently out over the bay, remembering the hell that we'd gone through, and the bond that we'd formed. When the lemonade arrived, Schaefer took a sip, savoured it, and said with a twinkle in his eye, "You know that we've been advertising in the States for a head of nursing, somebody to recruit and organise the staff for the various clinics." I nodded. Then he paused, arched one of his bushy white eyebrows and added, "An exceptionally qualified candidate just popped up, and I think you ought to talk to her personally." I said, "Sure. When do you want me to meet her?" He said, "Now would be ideal." I nodded, and he raised his arm and waved toward the car. The passenger side door opened, and a female figure stepped out. She was a bit too far away to see clearly, and had changed significantly in the past 10 months. But it was unmistakably Veronica Chase, RN. She looked both stunningly beautiful and very nervous. I could have probably managed the next part more genteelly, but my eyes misted with tears, and I bolted off the porch, spilling my lemonade down my pants in the process. Ronnie was standing there looking wary as I came rushing up. Of course, I didn't have a plan. I stopped abruptly and stood there gazing at her wonderingly, like I was afraid she might suddenly disappear. I have no idea how this beautiful woman could turn the fellow who used to be the smoothest talker in the Philippines into a tongue-tied teenage boy. She finally said in her low, throaty voice, "Hello, Eric. I didn't know whether you would want to see me." Okay, that ranked right up there with one of history's most ridiculous statements, but I could understand why she might view it that way. We had a long and tortured past, most of it involving antagonism and starvation. We had never as much as exchanged a hug, and I did have a reputation as being a profligate ladies' man, at least in her eyes. I got my emotions under control and said, "You do remember the part about me saying that I loved you, right? How do you think that's changed over the past 20 months? She looked like she had been holding her breath. She relaxed and said, "Well, it's a different world now. You're back to being rich and entitled, and I'm still just a scrub nurse from Albuquerque." I was about to tell her that she was the eternal love of my life when I heard a blood-curdling shriek from behind me. We both looked, and it was Missy. She had gotten back from her ride and seen Ronnie. Now she and Pi were thundering toward us like something out of the charge of the Light Brigade. We both cringed in immediate anticipation of being trampled to death. Missy reined the horse to a shuddering stop, catapulted out of the saddle, and ran toward Ronnie, arriving with enough force to knock her backward a step. Ronnie went, "Oof!" Missy threw her arms around her and proceeded to weep with joy. Ronnie looked equally delighted. Drat! Maybe I should take a few lessons from my kid. Both turned to me and Missy said peremptorily, "Daddy?" I got the hint and joined them for a group hug. It was several minutes before we parted, and there might have been some crying involved. "Damn allergies," Missy said with fervent delight. "Have you come to live with us? We both missed you a ton." Ronnie looked aghast and gave me a questioning stare. I said with enthusiasm, "Of course she is, kitten. I'm never going to let her leave." Missy grabbed Ronnie by the arm and said, "Please, please, please, Ronnie. We don't ever want you to go away." My kitten was much better at romance than her old man. I guess all it ever takes is honesty and sincerity. Ronnie smiled with relief and said, "That's up to your dad." I looked into those unreal grey eyes and blurted, "Veronica Chase, will you marry me?" I really got to work on my impulse control. It just popped out of my mouth. You could rightly say that my proposal was reckless and foolhardy, given that Ronnie and I had never had one romantic moment together. Nevertheless, it had been 3 years in the making. So, it wasn't unjustified. The courtship had been long and arduous, and we had overcome an incredible amount of misunderstanding and adversity. But you know who you're dealing with when you go through hell with somebody, and Veronica Chase was the only woman for me. I had longed for her strength and wisdom since Liberation Day, February 3rd, 1945. That date was etched on my heart, and she had come 7,000 miles to reunite with me, so there must have been something there. Ronnie gave me a sassy smile and said, "I thought you'd never ask." Then she threw herself into my arms and we kissed with feelings fueled by a 1.5 years of separation. It felt like the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place and my soul was finally complete. Naturally, my preteen daughter said, "Ooh." Ronnie's delay in getting back was easily explained. The army didn't let her out of their clutches until February of 46, and by that point she just assumed that I had moved on. The Paramount visit had been filmed in January, just before Ronnie mustered out. I asked her about the guy she was paired with in the picture, and she said, "His name was Tom. I didn't catch his last name. He was an extra in Sioux City Sioux, dumber than dirt, and his breath stank." I said incredulously, "You mean you never had a fling with him?" She laughed and said sardonically, "He made a pass, but I'd already given my heart to a Manila playboy. Even if he did live 7,000 miles away and I thought I'd never see him again." Then she stepped back and surveyed me with those incredible grey eyes. She said sincerely, "There was just too much to overcome. You were here, and I was there. And I knew there was a big social gap between us once you got out of that camp. I didn't think you would remember me." She added, "Then I saw the ad in the LA Times and I knew right away what you were thinking." Ronnie always had that eerie ability to read my mind. She continued. Dieter was the contact, so I wrote him, and he arranged my passage on the next flight to Manila. She got a playful look and added, apparently, you'd been unburdening yourself to him about your feelings for a certain scrub nurse. Our engagement lasted precisely 3 days. That was the length of time it took me to get a priest from Our Lady of Guadalupe. The guy knew that I was a barbarian, and so he married us without the banns. It never hurts to hedge your bets if you live on the charity of others, and a lot of money flowed downhill from my pocketbook to that shrine. Ronnie slept in the bedroom next to mine for the first 2 nights. That was because Missy still had difficulty sleeping. My kitten was perfectly normal during the day, but she couldn't keep the horrors of Santo Tomas out of her head at night. As a result, she had always slept in the same room as I did. Nevertheless, she was also old enough to know that a mum and dad slept together. So, she insisted on swapping rooms with Ronnie when we married. It was poignant, really. Little girls need strong female role models, and Missy idolised Ronnie. Her request to sleep by herself was her touching attempt to show Ronnie she could be just as brave as she was. In that respect, then, the door to the next room opened for my dear little daughter, and she was determined to walk through it with grace and courage. The fact that Ronnie both understood and assisted her in making that walk was further proof of the love of my life's commitment to us. I mean, seriously, devoting your wedding night to helping a poor little girl adjust to her changed circumstance was just so prototypically Ronnie. We might have come together by different paths. But nurture always trumps nature, and as odd as it might seem, we were already a family. Hence, there was a whirlwind of activity in Missy's new room while the wedding went on outside. Then, when it was time for Missy to go to sleep, we both took her down the hall to a newly painted pink fantasy, whimsically decorated with unicorns and rainbows, and featuring a 4-poster bed that was fit for a princess. I'd given my kitten a stuffed bunny rabbit to sleep with after we moved out of the camp. We called him Honey Bunny the Healing Bunny. I told her to hug him any time she felt the fear returning. Missy was clutching Honey Bunny tightly to her chest as we put her to bed that night, but my brave little kitten loved us both, and she wanted us to be happy. Now it was our turn. We shared a glass of red wine on the veranda, watching the ship lights out on Manila Bay. We were both nervous. Okay. I realise how ridiculous that might sound. The number of women I'd been with was somewhere in the several dozens, and by her admission, beautiful Ronnie had cut a swath through the entire US Army Air Force. I mean, anybody who could land Giles Pemberton had to be remarkable. In addition, the two of us had lived in close quarters in the most challenging circumstances for over 3 years. So, nerves should have been the furthest thing from either of our minds. But the fact was that the stakes were too high. Sexual intimacy is the way married couples build and reinforces their bond. Hence, good sex underwrites the marital situation, notwithstanding anything else that you might do together as a couple. That's why fidelity is so important. Our problem was that we had never been in a place where we were able to express physical desire for each other. We knew the other person checked all the boxes for an ideal mate. We shared the same values and beliefs, all of which had been tried and proven in the fiery crucible of Santo Tomas. We could trust each other unconditionally, and we'd supported each other through thick and thin. But desire is either there or it isn't. It's innate, and we had no experience in that realm. Even if we had been able to spend time alone in that awful place, a hot shower and a satisfying meal would take precedence over a hot night in bed, particularly given the final 1,000-calorie diet we were living on. So tonight was the first night we would explore the physical side of our relationship. The silvery light of the full tropical moon lit the room through the open French doors. Ronnie prepared for sex by simply taking off her dress and undergarments. She was a tough army nurse, not a frilly nightgown girl. As she did that, she carefully folded each item and painstakingly placed it on the chair on her side of the bed. It was clearly a habit she'd gotten into to preserve her things while in captivity. But it was the sexiest thing I had ever seen. That was mainly due to the fact that Nurse Veronica Chase had the kind of body that the classical artists from the Greeks to the Renaissance loved to immortalise. In Ronnie's case, the artist who would have captured her best is Peter Paul Rubens. That's because Ronnie was built like a fertility goddess, and she had no hang-ups whatsoever about nudity. My new wife had wide hips, a minuscule waist, and substantial round breasts, giving her a Rubenesque appearance. I mean, if female sexual attractiveness is related to their perceived ability to propagate the species, Ronnie looked like she could do the job single-handedly. She had gone from her usual 118 pounds to a skeletal 75 in captivity. She'd gained back 30 of it, so she didn't look emaciated anymore. But there wasn't an ounce of fat on her. Her flanks were muscular and shapely, and her stomach was flat. The roundness of her body was offset by slim, tapered legs that were a bit longer than average and gave her an almost coltish appearance. She glanced at me like she couldn't understand what I was gawping at. Then she cupped one big, full breast and said, "Oh, they're all yours, along with the rest of me." Then she just laid herself down in bed and looked at me expectantly. It was the exact opposite of Margarita's melodramatic approach to the act, but it was Ronnie to a T. Ronnie was unself-consciously all woman. Sex to her was just nurturing in another form. It was an expression of personal giving. Margarita was a selfish and narcissistic child. She had overwhelming needs, and sex was a theatrical production designed to highlight her control over the situation. Ronnie made her body available to me as means of emphasizing her commitment to me. She was underscoring the exclusivity of our union. Even so, sex was also something she enjoyed. That was obvious, because she looked at me intently and said, "What are you waiting for?" I had been standing there simply admiring her beauty, so hard yet soft, vulnerable but strong. I quickly shucked my clothes, leaving them in a heap on the floor. I didn't have Ronnie's exquisite self-discipline. I lay beside her, resting my head on one arm as I admired her big, beautiful tits. Guys love boobs, no matter what they tell you, ladies. It's like a woman's version of size doesn't matter. Ronnie's were not so much pendulous as full and rounded on her chest, with prominent pink nipples. I lightly stroked the nearest one. The nipple grew outrageously, and Ronnie sighed with pleasure. You develop a particular image of a person as you get to know them, and my perceptions of Nurse Veronica Chase had nothing to do with sexual abandonment. She was a woman of calm resolve and strict self-discipline. As a result, I had no idea whether she would be able to let herself go in the way one must in order to enjoy the act. That was clearly a misperception on my part. The woman in bed with me was already well down the road to being turned on. That was when it dawned on me that I was the problem. Because of our experience together, I had gotten an overdeveloped sense of Ronnie's controlled persona, and that perception was getting in the way of me just dipping into my usual aggressive bag of tricks. I mean, I just went for the goods in the case of every other female, and it was immaterial whether they came along with me, as long as I got my cookies. Looking at Ronnie lying there in the moonlight, with her gorgeous boobs rising and falling, I just couldn't bring myself to try any of my usual, generally disrespectful stunts to fire up a woman. So instead of diving directly for Ronnie's hoo-ha, I stroked her silky arms and the tops of her thighs, and watched her face as those powerful eyes clouded with lust. She uttered an undecipherable word, grabbed me by the back of the head, and dragged me down to a steamy, open-mouth kiss. It was no peck on the lips. This was the first passion we had ever shared, and it was worth the wait. Because this woman was evolving into a wildcat. Nurse Veronica Chase was one complex person. The naked female I was kissing was no longer the competent and disciplined angel of mercy I'd known over the past 4 years. Ronnie's mouth was wide and lush. It was almost the first thing I'd noticed about her, and it was hot and seeking. There was clearly a molten core beneath her disciplined surface. What you saw was what you got with Margarita. She was a selfish creature, put on this earth to please herself. She might marry and even have kids, but she had no depth or artifice. She was always simple and egocentric, and tragically, she would become irrelevant once she lost her sexual allure. Ronnie would be significant until her dying day. She'd proven that beyond any doubt in the 37 months that we'd spent in that godforsaken hellhole. But she was also capable of fulfilling a more basic and fundamental role. The girl really knew how to fuck. That shouldn't be remarkable because Ronnie was both beautiful and intelligent, and she had been around the block a few times. But it was so contrary to the woman I had known and maybe idealised that it made me pause. Ronnie, who was always perfectly attuned to me, brought herself back from her descent into mindless passion and said concerned, "What's wrong?" My feelings for her found another much higher gear and I said, "I was just marvelling. You are an amazing woman in so many ways." She gave me an exasperated look, one that I hadn't seen since our early days together, and said, "I'm happy you feel that way, Eric. But I need you to fuck me, not stare at me like an infatuated teenager." Now that was the Ronnie I knew. My God, that woman understood me. Challenge accepted. This creature was no longer the best scrub nurse in the Philippines. She was my mate, the one person on this earth I should be utterly intimate with. I turned off my pesky mind and all of the old instincts kicked in. It would be the biological imperative now. I took a little time to map her body. I needed to find out how all of Ronnie's hot buttons worked. You have to do that, because every woman is unique and every one of them responds differently. I dove back in for one more steamy kiss while my hand went seeking her little man in the boat. When I reached my target, it was very hot and wet. She grunted and bucked once and said dreamily, Good boy." Her eyes were screwed tight as she writhed under my ministrations. Then she lapsed into the sort of radical breathing you would typically associate with an Olympic sprint event. My wife had a deep rib cage, which was one of the reasons why her boobs were so prominent. It expanded and contracted dramatically as her breasts rose and fell. When my fingers entered her sacred gates, she gave a high-pitched whimper of need, spread her legs, and elevated her hips to allow greater access. The female pheromones and the exotic sensations of exploring a person I considered my most faithful friend and companion blew my mind. There would be no more jejune ruminating about the history and meaning of our relationship. I was going to breed this bitch. Ronnie had already worked herself up to a frenzy by the time I'd rolled between her widely spread thighs and inserted myself into her hot and churning tunnel. If I'd thought about it, I might have sentimentalized the moment, but I was way past thinking. Ronnie made a kind of ker-chunk grunt as I slid into her. Then there was a spate of super rapid breathing ending in the cawing "have mercy" sound of a woman experiencing a major orgasm. Even Margarita didn't come that fast. I could see why Ronnie'd had Pemberton on a leash. Once the contractions passed, she opened her eyes and stared at me in the exact same speculative way a predator would eye its prey. No more exploration. She knew what she wanted, and it was time to give it to her. She reached back and got a good solid grip on the bars of the headboard, elevating those gorgeous breasts in my face as she did it. She wrapped her long slim legs tightly around my arse and ground her heels into my butt. Then she slowly pushed me a few millimeters further into herself. Once she had us both properly situated, she hissed, "Fuck me! Fuck me hard! Pound me!" She really didn't need to ask. I was a mindless machine after that exhibition of sheer sexual talent. The ferocious, wet-slapping sounds, grunts, moans, and animalistic jungle noises made me glad that the walls were poured concrete, built to weather typhoons. Because Missy, who was sleeping right next door, would have thought I was killing my new wife. In the meantime, Ronnie was writhing in ecstasy, totally out of control. Her movements aided by the copious amount of perspiration and other lubricants that were between us. I felt the sweat dripping off my nose as I held myself above her, looking down at the ecstatic emotions passing across her beautiful face, while she bucked and thrashed beneath me. We pleasured each other for an interminable period. I might add, one that I didn't think was humanly possible. That's when I heard her start to wind up for a life-extinguishing orgasm. Just as she reached her pinnacle, she shoved one of the bed's decorative pillows in her mouth to hold down the screams. It was a prudent idea, because even reinforced concrete has its limitations. That was when I felt something coming at me from long ago and far away. It hit my loins like the arrival of the rapture. The next several seconds were a mix of extreme pleasure and life-threatening cardiac stress, while I experienced an ultimate bonding event with the woman I loved. I had never come like that in my life. When all of the commotion had died down, she opened her eyes and looked at me like she was having a hyper-rational moment and said simply, "You never need to doubt. I will love you forever." Then she lapsed into deep sleep. She whimpered as I removed myself from her, but it was clear that Nurse Veronica Chase was gone for the night. And what a night it had been. I had discovered to my eternal delight that my new wife possessed all of the womanly virtues, strong, wise, nurturing, but also passionate, exciting, and satisfying beyond imagining. I would treasure that divine gift throughout the many years we would spend together, and I would never take it for granted. As my blood pressure slowly returned to merely stroke status, I lay on my back and thought about what I had learned. 5 years ago, I'd led an ostentatious existence full of false friends and unfaithful women. The Japanese took that from me. In turn, I had built a life of purpose out of the suffering. It's a boring cliché, one that's so corny that it's hard to say it. But my life changed for the better the moment I dedicated myself to other people. Hence, I knew that service to others would be my pole star, and my little family would give me motivation, direction, and happiness for the rest of my days. Epilogue. The red and white Eurocopter, EC-135, swept out of the overcast and hovered over the landing pad at the summit of Mount Samat. It touched down lightly and a man in his 60s popped out. He walked around the front and gently and lovingly assisted a very old woman out of the right side passenger door. It was undoubtedly an elderly son helping his aged mother visit the Mount Samat Shrine of Valor. Mount Samat was the place where the remnants of the American and Filipino army made their last stand in April of 1942. 24 years later, an elaborate shrine was built to honor that sacrifice. It marked a place of supreme honor and unspeakable suffering. The tourists waiting to go up into the big cross situated at the top of the mountain glanced casually in the direction of the arriving helicopter. But visits by wealthy people were routine, so they went back to admiring the colossal steel and concrete structure they were standing in front of. The arriving couple made their way gingerly down the zigzag path to the colonnaded shrine and museum, which is 100 yards further down the hill. The woman was in her late 80s, but she walked briskly with her head high past the museum building and into the green space where the individual markers commemorated the units and people who'd fought there. Reverentially, she approached a simple stone slab. It was perhaps 7 feet tall, with a flagpole behind it. A short, flower-lined path allowed access to the memorial itself. She and her son stopped and read the inscription. It said, "To the Angels." In honor of the valiant American military women who gave so much of themselves in the early days of World War II, they provided care and comfort to the gallant defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. They lived on a starvation diet, shared the bombing, strafing, sniping, sickness, and disease, while working endless hours of heartbreaking duty. These nurses always had a smile, a tender touch, and a kind word for their patients. They truly earned the name the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. Underneath was a list of 77 women, 66 Army and 11 Navy nurses in 3 long columns. The old woman stepped forward and stood next to the stone slab, tracing names with her finger and mouthing little words of endearment. She reached a name and paused. Then she kissed the tip of her finger and placed it back on the name. She said quietly, "I'll be seeing you soon, Mother." She turned to her son and said, "Do you have the plaque?" The son handed her a small bronze tablet that she laid gently on the ground at the side of the memorial. She had paid the shrine to ensure the groundskeepers would take care of it. The old woman was immensely wealthy. The plaque would be there for a very long time. It read, "In honor of Eric Grayson and Veronica Grayson, Nee Chase, my parents, from the littlest angel." She turned to her son, whose name was also Eric, and said, "I'm tired, my dear boy. Let's go home." And the very last of the fabled Angels of Bataan made her way back to the helicopter. She knew she would never return. Author's note: I fictionalized Ronnie Chase's character. Otherwise, this story is as historically accurate as I could make it. I even used the names of the real angels throughout. Maud Iverson was 60 when she was liberated. She was too weakened by her ordeal to stay in the army. She married a widower she'd known as a young nurse and died in 1956. Josie Nesbitt mustered out as a major in 1947 and married a former soldier. She died in 1993 at age 97. A ceremony was finally held in DC in 1992 to honour the angels. But by then, Mama Josie was too frail to make it. Still, it didn't stop her from sending a note to pay tribute to her girls. The angels got a Presidential Unit citation, and each got a Bronze Star, which in no way adequately rewarded them for the courage and dedication that they all displayed. Then they just quietly merged back into civilian life. In fact, it's possible that the mum who lived next door to you when you were growing up was a hero of Bataan and Corregidor. The angels never considered themselves as having done anything more than their duty. But as for me, I believe that we must always honour the best and bravest among us, and the Angels of Bataan are in the front rank of that exalted group.